Chapter 37:12. Yi Mulin looked at her. "I'll pick her up when I get back. I'll see her anyway," she said guiltily and stared at his eyes. "Yi Mulin, you'll definitely agree." He started the car and said indifferently, "Are you afraid that my mother will eat you up? You two used to be so close." Bai Shueli looked at him and said slowly, "I just feel that someone has been calling her mother-in-law for the past few years. Now that I've suddenly appeared, isn't it weird? What do you think, Yi Mulin?" He glared at her fiercely. She was really good at talking. Bai Shueli smiled hypocritically. "You're Yi Mulin?" He held her chin. "You can say these words to me again tonight, when you sleep, okay?" She slapped his hand away and straightened herself. "Bai Ainin is still here, don't teach her bad things." "What did I say?" "You're thinking too much, Bai Shueli." He started the car. He went to his mother's place first and carried Bai Ainin upstairs. He didn't force her. Bai Shueli was relieved and felt that Mr. Yi was a good person. He came down 10 minutes later and got into the car. No matter how Bai Shueli asked him, he didn't say anything. She muttered, "Yi Mulin, won't your mother ask where Bai Ainin came from?" He couldn't help it anymore and rolled his eyes at her. "My mother has some basic knowledge about physiology. Didn't she have a cesarean section? Do you want me to tell her in detail?" She couldn't help but snort. "You know what I mean." He started the car and lit a cigarette. After smoking for a long time, he said slowly, "You don't want to see my mother, do you, Yi Mulin?" She was furious again and turned her head away without saying a word. She fell into his trap again when she was angry. He drove the car directly to his office. When she found out, they had already arrived at the courtyard. Bai Shueli patted the car door and shouted, "Drive out, we'll be seen by others." He stopped the car and looked at her. "Bai Shueli, I'm going out to do something later. I'll send you on the way. Why are you reacting so strongly? Do you think I'm an embarrassment or that you're an embarrassment?" She saw that he was angry and bit her lips. "Yi Mulin, your marriage with Wen Yuan, it's over. We're going to announce it," he said coldly. Actually, he didn't plan to do so, especially on his side. However, Wen Yuan seemed to feel that he shouldn't take the position, even if it was fake. In the end, he didn't object to it anymore. Bai Shueli shrank in the car. "Aren't you afraid that your popularity will drop?" "At most, I'll just retire and go home to have children." He got out of the car with a cigarette in his mouth. He opened the door and asked her, "Do you want to wait in the car for an hour? There are so many people here. There will only be more people who will see you." Seeing that the trick was effective, she immediately jumped down. Yi Mulin walked in front. She followed behind him with small steps and whispered, "Wait for me." He immediately stopped like a brake, and Bai Shueli bumped into his back. She covered her head and glared at him. "Yi Mulin, are you always teasing me for fun? It's quite interesting." He turned around and held her hand. She was stunned. She stared at the hands they were holding and then said softly, "Yi Mulin." He looked into her eyes and said calmly and seriously, "If I can't give you a title, a position that can stand by my side, what kind of man am I?" Updated tomorrow morning. This book came from Chapter 37:13. Bai Shueli looked at him and said slowly, "It sounds like a good plan, but Yi Mulin, are you sure it's true? Why does it sound like a conspiracy to me?" She raised her head. "Is it really not your bad taste?" As she spoke, she walked ahead of him. As she walked, she complained, "A man in his 40s still has such a bad taste. How childish." He stood at his original spot and stared at her back without a care in the world. The subordinates around them secretly looked at the chief. After a while, Yi Mulin stopped Bai Shueli. "Shueli." She was still walking, looking rather angry. He was amused and coughed lightly. "Bai Shueli, you've gone the wrong way." She turned her head. "Yi Mulin, why didn't you tell me earlier?" "You didn't ask." He smiled, walked over, and gently held her hand. "All right, let's go." There were so many eyes around, but he didn't mind being seen. He held her hand and walked towards his office. Now, almost everyone in the office knew that Nocturnal Chieftain had changed his wife. With this kind of identity, it was impossible for his mistress to appear in front of the public. The only possibility was that he had changed wives. And it was the original formula and the original taste. Everyone just watched, their gazes filled with indescribable meanings. When they reached the office, Bai Shueli complained, "Yi Mulin is not good." "Why not?" He took off his coat and poured her a glass of water. The texture of his shirt was very good, and it accentuated his extraordinary temperament. Bai Shueli just stared at him, a little dazed, and it took her a long time to come back to her senses. And he just looked at her, understanding in his eyes. Bai Shueli suddenly stammered, "Yi Mulin, I wasn't looking at you." He smiled. "I know." But his smile was a little warm and strange. Bai Shueli recalled what she had said before, so she pursed her lips and said, "I don't want them to talk about you behind your back." He walked over, put the glass in her hand and looked down at her. "I don't want others to talk about you, Shirley. You're my only wife. There's nothing that can't be made public." She looked up, her gaze a little uneasy. Perhaps it was because she hadn't been living a good life all these years, so the excessive happiness made her feel a little unreal. His lips moved but no words came out. Yi Mulin hugged her and placed her on his chest. His voice was gentle. "Shirley, I'll be a good husband and father in the future, okay?" "I do," she said, leaning against him. "But don't be so bad." He chuckled, "It's probably because I've been holding it in for too long. I've been alone for too long." She looked up and asked in a somewhat deceitful manner, "Aren't you staying with Wen Yuan and Xiang Nan?" Yi Mulin reached out and pinched her face. "Silly egg, how could it be the same? How is that different?" He had already let go of her. "All right, I'll deal with something first. If you keep sticking to me like this, Secretary Li will see it." He paused. "She will broadcast it to the entire building." "Is it that powerful?" Bai Shueli was a little surprised. Yi Mulin sat down and thought for a while. "Because she knows that I want her to say that it's the basic rule of a secretary." Bai Shueli thought for a while before she understood what he meant. She took back what she had said just now. He was really too bad. "I'll update at night, try to update earlier. I'll update after a few days." Chapter 37:14. He chuckled softly and started to work. Bai Shueli saw that he was working very seriously and didn't dare to disturb him. She just watched silently at the side. She drank water and took out her phone to play a game. After playing for a while, she felt that something was wrong. After thinking about it, she finally figured out the reason. It seemed like she hadn't been this relaxed in a long time. In the past few years, she had been pregnant, giving birth, and taking care of Den. She had been working and taking care of the child at the same time. She had no time for herself at all. Now that she was back, even though Anan was still by her side, it was different. Her mood and everything else were different. It was as though she had become very at ease. No matter what happened, he would always be by her side. With him around, all she had to do was enjoy her beautiful life. Her fingers loosened and she looked up at him. Yi Mulin was handling work, his gaze indifferent. Bai Shueli bit her lips. Her eyes were a little watery. Then she got up and ran over. There was no one else in the office, so she boldly hugged his waist from behind and said softly, "Yi Mulin." Through the layer of his shirt, she could feel his muscles under the fine fabric. It seemed like he had put on a little more weight these few days. How did he survive the past few years? Her little hands were placed in front of him, moving around as though she was patrolling her territory. Actually, Bai Shueli didn't have any intention of being intimate. This was his office, and she just wanted to feel his warmth. However, Yi Mulin clearly misunderstood. He grabbed her hand and seemed to hesitate for a moment before asking in a low voice, "You want it?" She didn't come back to her senses and let out an Yi Mulin grabbed her little hand and said hoarsely, "I have something to do now. How about tonight, then?" She was stunned for a moment before she finally understood what he meant. She bit his neck angrily. "Yi Mulin, what are you thinking about? I don't have that intention." He said gently, "If you don't have that intention, then why are you always on my body?" "I'm just counting how many ribs you have." She only managed to say that after a long time. He laughed and ran around with her hand. In the end, he even ran to a place where he shouldn't be. "Don't forget to count here. You're shameless." This is the office. Her voice carried a hint of humph, but it was so soft and tender that honey could drip out. He really didn't have this kind of intention, but he was provoked by her. He reached out and pulled her onto his lap. After kissing her for a while, he said hoarsely, "If there's anything, don't tease me. Otherwise, if I really carry you to the lounge, you probably won't have time to see your chief editor." Bai Shueli stared at him with a hair-raising gaze, and then retracted her gaze. He looked at her, laughed softly, and went back to his work. Just then, Secretary Li came in. As an experienced person, she could clearly feel that the office was full of adultery, but she pretended not to notice. Bai Shueli's face was a little red. She was lying on the sofa playing games, while Yi Mulin and Secretary Li were chatting. Occasionally, she would be attracted by his voice. His voice was really nice to listen to. Yi Mulin, who was talking to Secretary Li, inadvertently looked over and saw his little wife looking at him with a dazed expression. She looked a little fascinated. He chuckled softly. What a good-for-nothing. He looked as if he was mesmerized by her. End of chapter. Chapter 37:15. Bai Shueli played the game for 5 minutes and was in a daze for 10 minutes. She was still in a daze when Yi Mulin was done with his work. Let's go. He held his coat in one hand and her bag in the other so that she could put on her clothes. She looked at him after tidying herself up. You go out alone. And Secretary Li, I'll ask the driver to send her, he said lightly. And Bai Shueli replied naturally, just let her ride in the same car as us. Yi Mulin looked at her and frowned. Bai Shueli, it's more appropriate to call you an idiot. Yi Mulin, you're insulting me. She glared at him angrily. He held her hand and walked out, saying slowly, it's not convenient for Secretary Li to be in the same car as us. How is it inconvenient? She retorted naturally, but then she paused and didn't say anything else. Because it didn't seem to be convenient. His gaze fell on her face for a few seconds, and she lowered her head even more. He smiled and pulled her downstairs to the car. In the car, she didn't sit in the front, but in the back seat and didn't speak. Yi Mulin felt that she was a little embarrassed, so he focused on driving and chatted with her casually. Actually, you don't have to worry. There's nothing wrong with Anne's IQ, and it hasn't been lowered because of you. Bai Shueli wanted to explode again. This man had really become bad and hairy. He didn't look like a chief at all. He was simply a bandit leader. She was depressed. If she hadn't seen him working hard to translate for her last night, she would have really been angry with him. She sat like a little girl, telling herself to be magnanimous and ignore him. Yi Mulin looked at the rearview mirror, and a chuckle appeared at the corner of his mouth. However, his smugness lasted until he saw her chief editor. He had always thought that she would be a woman in her 40s who wasn't harsh at all, but he really didn't expect her to be a man in his 30s. He was quite good-looking and had good taste in everything he wore. At this moment, the young man was sitting in the cafe, drinking coffee lightly. He looked very artistic. Yi Mulin looked at Bai Shueli. You're usually with him? It's work. Don't think too much. She stopped him. Yi Mulin, don't be so narrow-minded. Do you have female employees around you too? I didn't say anything when you were with Secretary Li all the time. You can say something too. He lowered his head and emphasized. I really don't mind you being jealous. In fact, he still had to hold Secretary Li to the same standard, so when necessary he would give Secretary Li a promotion. It would be the same even if he changed a male secretary. Bai Shueli was really a bit dumbfounded. She looked at him and said, Yi Mulin. He grunted, I mind. He was so straightforward that she didn't know what to say. She was stunned for a long time. Instead, he held her hand and walked towards the man. When she came back to her senses, she said in a low voice, Yi Mulin, what are you doing? You're being very childish. I've worked with George for 2 to 3 years. You can't do this to me. I embarrassed you, he said in a low voice. Bai Shueli, you're being unfair. I'll take you to my office. You should introduce your colleagues to me, shouldn't you? He was so eloquent that Bai Shueli couldn't refuse a word. Moreover, it would be really rude if she made a scene at this time. End of chapter. Chapter 37:16. She could only tug at his hand and said in a very soft voice, "Then don't talk nonsense." Yi Mulin smiled faintly and walked in front of George. Bai Shueli bit the bullet and introduced George, "My husband, Mulin. This is my editor-in-chief, George. He has been taking care of me for the past few years." She cleverly separated Yi Mulin's name, and Yi Mulin didn't care about it at the moment. George, the fake foreigner, didn't connect Yi Mulin's identity either. Firstly, he didn't care about these things. Secondly, the man in front of him was too young and good-looking. He couldn't associate him with those big shots in the news. George was still a little arrogant, because he was really a big shot in the publishing industry. He didn't really think much of Yi Mulin, but he was still polite to Bai Shueli. He called her Ruth and wanted to talk to her about the manuscript. Bai Shueli looked at Yi Mulin and said, "Go on with your work. I'll call you when I'm ready." Yi Mulin nodded at George and left. George didn't take this man seriously at first. Although this man's temperament and demeanor were first class, he thought that women needed a man who came out to work. How capable could he be? But when he saw Yi Mulin's car, he didn't dare to underestimate it. It was a phantom worth more than 10 million. When he looked at Bai Shueli again, the look in his eyes was a little different. Then he said softly, "Ruth, I want to say that I'm a little sorry. We talked about it before, but because we didn't sign the contract, the higher-ups decided to let Selena write this book. She did very well in her previous book, and the readers really liked her." Bai Shueli was stunned for a moment. Then she looked at George and said, "Didn't we agree on this? I've already translated 80 pages of this book. You didn't even take a look before you decided?" George shrugged. "It's a decision from above." "Is it because Serena is your girlfriend?" Bai Shueli asked. She suddenly decided to be willful. It was because she knew George well that she did not sign the contract and agree to translate the 80 pages. However, it was obvious that he had tricked her and given this opportunity to his girlfriend. Bai Shueli had been in this industry for 2 years and had a certain level of control over the market. This book would definitely be popular. She was a little angry, but she tried her best to control herself. After she asked the question, George looked at her quietly and smiled faintly. "Rose, isn't this how the world is? Everything depends on relationships. Serena is very cute." There was no need to say anything more. He got up on his own, which was equivalent to announcing the end of their partnership. Bai Shueli was still sitting there. Her voice was very soft. "Do you believe that I recorded your words? I can sue you." "Go ahead. It won't change anything." George turned his head and smiled at her. "Actually, Ruth, you can sell me the translated version, or the whole book, for the same price as before. It's just that the name is Serena's name, isn't it?" Bai Shueli picked up the coffee cup in front of her and splashed it at George's face. Then Bai Shueli said word by word, "Let me tell you now, I don't lack money." George wiped his face and said ruthlessly, "I'll make sure you can't survive in the publishing industry. I told you I don't lack money." Bai Shueli stretched out her hand, and a huge diamond ring almost blinded George's eyes. "I'll make sure you can't survive in the publishing industry, you scum." Chapter 37:17. Viciousness flashed past George's eyes. "Is that so? Let's wait and see." With that, he was about to leave in a huff. "Wait a minute." Bai Shueli grabbed her bag and stopped him. He turned around and stared into her eyes. "What's the matter?" Bai Shueli put on a fake smile. "Please pay for your coffee." After saying that, he twisted his waist and left, looking very seductive. George looked embarrassed and angry. He looked at Bai Shueli's back with a complicated gaze. In fact, he had hinted to her to be with him. Of course, he used a very gentle method, but she pretended not to understand. If it wasn't for her usefulness, he would have abandoned her long ago. Until Serena appeared, he felt that she could completely replace Ruth and get the most benefits. After Bai Shueli went out, she was still very angry. This was a job that she loved. How could it be like this? She was angry, so she found a cafe below Yi Mulin's office building and sat down. She took out the small USB flash drive from her bag. There were a few times when she wanted to throw it away, but after a long time, she still couldn't bear to. This was her hard work, and this was a job that she loved. It wasn't just for survival. To her, this was also a beautiful memory. It proved that she, by Shueli, could live well on her own. But in her heart, if she wasn't by Yi Mulin's side, what would happen to her and Tanan? Her gaze fell on the diamond ring on her finger, and she smiled. Actually, it was really good to be by his side. Her mood was a little better, and she didn't want to affect him. So, she waited patiently for him. When she was too bored, she would play games on her phone. After Yi Mulin dealt with the matter, he called her. She said that she was downstairs. He seemed a little surprised. You've settled it so quickly. By Shueli, I thought you would fight for the daily necessities of our family. She was dejected. It's over. Over? Yi Mulin raised his eyebrows and said, I'll come over right away. She replied with an oh, looking dejected. When they met, she lowered her head. Yi Mulin walked over and pulled her ear. What's wrong? I want to eat. Hungry, she said piteously, following him like a little henchman. Yi Mulin didn't force her. He brought her to a very high-class restaurant and asked for a private room. Seeing how familiar he was, she knew that he often used this place to entertain people. A person of his status shouldn't eat out casually, but she could feel that after they were together, he tried his best to be friendly and didn't put on the airs of a leader. She felt a little warm in her heart, but she still felt that she couldn't be too selfish. It wasn't good to let him show his face in public just for her own freedom. After she finished speaking, he poured a cup of tea for her. His every gesture was pleasing to the eye. It's nothing. Things are different now, and I often come to the place I brought you to, he said calmly. Bai Shueli grabbed his hand. I just don't want you to work too hard. For a moment, he had a different feeling in his heart. Only Bai Shueli could give him this kind of feeling. It was one thing to be touched, but it was another thing to say it from a man's mouth. Yi Mulin coughed lightly. Really? Then you hugged me so hard last night and asked me to use more strength. Do you think I'm not working hard then? Bai Shueli spat a mouthful of tea straight on his face. End of this chapter. Chapter 37:18. The gift of love. Yi Mulin glared at her as tea dripped down his face. Then his shirt and trousers. Bai Shueli. He emphasized. She knew that she was in trouble and immediately grabbed a tissue to wipe his face. She apologized softly, I'm sorry, I didn't do it on purpose. I didn't know you would say that. She paused. Yi Mulin, if you were serious, I wouldn't have said that to you. She glared at him and wiped his face, shirt, and trousers. Actually, she didn't have any other thoughts at the time. His trousers were wet, so she wiped them clean. That was it. But she felt that something was wrong after wiping it a few times. She looked up at him. Yi Mulin sipped his tea calmly and gave her a hair-raising smile. Go on. She immediately retracted her hand and bit her lip. Yi Mulin, how am I supposed to wipe you like this? She picked up the cup again and complained softly, You're a pervert. Yi Mulin didn't think much of it. You let a man who has been abstinent for 2 to 3 years not have any reaction to his wife. Either you or I have a problem. He changed the topic. Oh yeah, what's going on? Bai Shueli looked at him. You mean George? She told him what had happened and then said, Am I being childish? I clearly knew that he was such a person, yet I still argued with him. Yi Mulin smiled. She couldn't help but say, I know you must think that it's not worth mentioning, but it's still quite sad for me. She lowered her head. She looked quite cute. Yi Mulin thought that he had been a straight man since he was young and had no interest in girls' plush toys. But as soon as he saw Bai Shueli, he had a feeling that she was a little toy, a toy that belonged to him and only him. She was already a mother, but he still treated her like a little toy. Seeing that she was so sad, he couldn't help but reach out to touch her little head. What's wrong? Nothing, I'm just angry. She hugged his arm and said softly, I'm also a little sad. She leaned against him and said softly, But I'm also very happy. She tilted her head. I lost my job, but I have you now. She looked very happy, but he could see that she was disappointed. He reached out and rubbed her hair. Really? She grunted and took out a small flash drive from her pocket. After looking at it for a long time, she said softly, Yi Mulin, let's forget about this. I'll cook for you at home in the future, okay? She was about to throw it into the glass when he stopped her. Didn't you put in a lot of effort? With that, he put it into his pocket. Bai Shueli looked at him. Are you keeping it as a souvenir? He just smiled. At this time, the waiter also came in to serve the dishes. His service was especially attentive. Also because he knew Yi Mulin's identity, after serving the dishes, he asked respectfully, Chief, do you need us to serve you here? Yi Mulin gestured for them to leave and then looked at his little wife. Aren't you hungry? Let's eat. Don't you want to comfort me? She asked dryly, resting her sharp chin on his shoulder. Yi Mulin patted her face and said softly, I'm your biggest comfort. End of this chapter. Chapter 37:19. A gift of 1,200 words. She was still a little unsatisfied as she ate angrily. As she ate, she mumbled, Old men are so insensitive. Yi Mulin only smiled. He ate quickly, mainly because he was really hungry after working for half a day. After he finished eating, he saw that she was still unhappy, so he carried her and walked to the lounge. Bai Shueli was a little dumbfounded. Why didn't she know that there was such a place here? It wasn't until he placed her on the soft bed that she tugged at his collar and asked, Tell me honestly, did anyone give you a woman here? He chuckled. Someone gave it to me. She was instantly enraged. Pinching his face, she said, Then tell me honestly, have you ever? Yi Mulin allowed her to mess around, but his eyes were very clear as he looked at her. I was drunk at that time. And then? She grabbed his collar and asked fiercely, Did you kiss her, or touch her? Yi Mulin raised his hand. I kissed her and realized that something was wrong. Does that count? She glared at him for a long time before tears welled up in her eyes. She reached out and punched him. Yi Mulin, you can't just keep this to yourself. Even if you touched her, you can't tell me. I won't mind. His heart softened as he stroked her little face. I didn't touch her. Be good, don't cry. He kissed her, and touched her. Even though he knew that it wasn't a good place, he couldn't help but press her down and do it once. He could only bear to force himself to do it once. After that, he cleaned her up carefully and hugged her. Shueli, I really feel like we've returned to the time when we were newlyweds. You were so fierce back then. She didn't agree. He pressed her head against his chest. What I mean is, I've returned to the state where I can be happy at any time. Bai Shueli looked up. You're too shameless. He smiled, kissed her, and let her sleep for a while. He used his phone to deal with some work. In the afternoon, he took her directly to the place where Su Fu and Hao Yun lived to pick up and Bai Shueli was still a little uncomfortable, but Su Fu was extremely considerate. With a few words, he dispelled her uneasiness. He originally wanted to ask them to stay for dinner, but Yi Mulin refused, saying that he still had work to deal with. Su Fu was happy to hear that. Shueli just came back, and you're already busy with work. How many things do you have to do? Yi Mulin turned his head and looked at Bai Shueli. He chuckled softly and said, I'll find time to accompany her. Only then did Su Fu let him go. After thinking for a while, he asked Anan to stay. You do your work. Anan will stay here for a few days. Xiaonan was like a mini Shueli. She was really fun, but she wasn't as silly as Shueli. Her intelligence was inherited from her son, and that was a good thing. Bai Shueli looked at Yi Mulin. Actually, she wanted him to speak up for her. She wasn't working now, so she could take care of Anan. However, Yi Mulin pretended not to see it. She was furious. When she got into the car, she complained, Why didn't you bring Anan home? Yi Mulin fastened his seatbelt and looked at her. Because it's not convenient. Bai Shueli glared at him. What's not convenient about it? Then, she thought of something and stopped talking in anger. He was now a middle-aged greasy man. He thought about that kind of thing all day long. He said that he had to go back to deal with work, but the moment he got home, he pressed down on her and did it a few times. She was afraid that he would make a mistake. He was the one who did the hard work, but in the end, she was the one lying on the bed miserably. When she was done, it was already 9 o'clock. There was the smell of food in the air, and he was on the phone in a low voice. He seemed to be talking about some acquisition. Bai Shueli turned over and lay straight. She rubbed her small waist, feeling that it was going to break. Where did he get his stamina from? Seeing that she was awake, Yi Mulin hung up the phone and walked over. He lowered his head and kissed her. His voice was also hoarse. "You're awake?" End of this chapter. Chapter 37:20. The Gift of Love 4. She sat up and looked at the night sky outside. She frowned. "Yi Mulin, can't you control yourself? Is that a complaint?" He kissed her and chuckled. "You don't like it?" Bai Shueli wrapped her arms around his neck and said softly, "I like it, but it's a bit tiring." He carried her up and put a thick robe on her. "I'll control myself in the future. Absence makes the heart grow fonder. Besides, we haven't been together for more than 2 years." He couldn't be satisfied with 2 or 3 times. She glanced at him. Actually, she knew that, which was why she let him do as he pleased. She did like it when he hugged her, but it would be tiring and painful if it was too much. However, he doted on her very much. He would carry her to eat and prepare food for her. Bai Shueli looked at him. "Don't you have work to do?" Yi Mulin smiled. "Aren't you my most important work?" She rolled her eyes at him, but she felt sweet in her heart. After the meal, he really went to work. Bai Shueli really had nothing to do. She lay on the bed and played games, waiting for him to sleep. Yi Mulin came back from the study at midnight. When he opened the door, he saw her lying on her stomach playing games. He walked over and patted her butt. "It hurts your eyes. Are you done?" She turned over and hugged his neck. "You look so tired." He rubbed his brows and chuckled. "Yeah, there's too much work." His words had a double meaning. She blushed and bit her lips. "If you're so busy with work, you can take your time with other things." Her voice was lingering in the night, making his heart flutter. "Think about it. It's not like we're in a hurry. We'll be together every day." She hugged him after she said that. Yi Mulin grunted softly, but he was a bit absent-minded and perfunctory. When Bai Shueli saw his expression, she punched him angrily. He laughed. "Any man wouldn't want to endure this kind of thing. It's not like we can't do it. We can do it whenever we want." She wanted to ignore him, but he unbuttoned his shirt and threw it at her face. "I'm going to take a shower." She tore it off. "Scoundrel." The sound of running water came from the bathroom, and then it was his voice. "Bai Shueli, if you scold me again, I'll come out and press you down 2 more times." She hugged the quilt and blushed. She complained in a low voice before lying down with the quilt over her. In a moment he lay down and pulled her into his arms and kissed her for a long time. She felt that he wanted it, but for some reason he did not touch her. She calmed down and whispered in his arms, "You didn't bring an home because of this, didn't you?" Yi Mulin reached out to touch the fur of the little fellow in his arms and smiled faintly. "You think too much. It's just that my mother wants Anan to stay for a few more days. She likes Anan very much." He paused for a moment. Her uncle Hao has never had a child. Maybe he's too old to have one. She's always liked little girls. Xiangnan is a boy. I've never seen her dote on anyone so much. "Oh," she said softly, "I misunderstood you." He lowered his head. "In fact, it's not a complete misunderstanding. You've guessed a small part of the reason." She hit him. He smiled. "Tomorrow, I'll take you to a place. There's a special gift for you. But you have to wait for me to get off work. By the way, Shueli, you have nothing to do at home tomorrow. Go to work with me." End of this chapter. Chapter 37:21. She looked up at him. Will the mysterious Yi Mulin give me a house or a car, or will he give me all his property? As she spoke, she smiled cheekily and rubbed her face against his chest softly. He lowered his head and kissed her. That's fine too. After he entered politics, his property was handed over to a financial consultant for investment. Now he had 10 billion yuan. Yi Mulin was the only superior who lived a luxurious life. However, before Bai Shueli came back, he was still very low-key. After she came back, he couldn't let her and Anan suffer. There should still be something. Bai Shueli looked up and kissed his chin. Hubby is so nice. He smiled and suddenly pressed her down. He kissed her fiercely and his eyes seemed to be on fire. He really wanted to have a good time, but thinking of her small body, he still let her go. The next day, she was brought to the general office by him like a little kid. It was very public, but everyone there was Yi Mulin's subordinates. Although there were some gossips, no one dared to say a word to the outside. However, there was always an airtight wall. Even Yi Jinggang knew about it. He called his son. Mulin, what's wrong with you? You can just raise by Xueli secretly when she comes back. You made it known to everyone. Do you still want to rise in the future? Yi Mulin directly told his father. When Yuan and I have divorced, and Xiangnan is Mubai's Ion, I have no feelings for Wen Yuan. Even if there is, it is only family. There was a shout from Yi Jinggang. This was really bad. These little bastards. It was really messed up. His eldest daughter-in-law married his eldest son and had a child with his younger son. His younger son was now back with someone else, but he had a relationship with his sister-in-law. Was there a relationship now? But the only thing he could be sure of was that he had no reason to oppose Yi Mulin and Bai Xueli anymore. Otherwise, let Mulin keep raising Mubai's son? That didn't seem very good. Yi Jinggang was silent for a long time before he said in a low voice, "Do as you see fit. There is only one thing you said yourself. Xiangnan is our child. You can't hurt the child's heart. Xiangnan has always known. Also, I will handle it well." Yi Mulin said indifferently. Yi Jinggang let out a long sigh. His mood was very complicated. He didn't know why, but he had a feeling that he couldn't interfere in the affairs of his children. However, he didn't want to interfere anymore. If he continued like this, then the remaining affection would be wiped clean. After hanging up the phone, Yi Mulin tilted his head and looked at Bai Xueli. She also looked at him eagerly. "Your dad knows?" He grunted and pulled her into his arms out of habit. He rested his chin on her hair. "Are you angry?" She shook her head. Yi Mulin smiled warmly and said in a low voice, "If you don't want to see him, I won't ask you to. You just need to be my wife and be An's mother, okay?" As he said that, their past seemed to have returned to reality. Bai Xueli hugged him back and did not say anything. She just hugged him and felt his warmth. Secretary Li saw her at the door and left with a smile. She shook her head. Newlyweds were not as clingy as them, but it was indeed not easy. Secretary Li left. In the office, Yi Mulin kissed the person in his arms. "Well, you're already a mother, but you're still so clingy. It's obvious that you're hugging me, okay?" She glared at him. "You're still blaming me." Chapter 37:22. Yi Mulin smiled. "All right, good girl. I have to deal with official business." "Didn't you say that your biggest official business is me?" She put what she had learned into practice. He was stunned for a moment before he smiled. "You're different after marrying me. You've become smarter." She glared at him. "I'm not married yet." Yi Mulin coughed lightly. "Actually, Xueli, you don't have to propose to me 3 times a day." She was furious. Lying on his shoulder, she purposely bit his neck and even sucked out a hickey. He let her be but warned her, "I have a meeting later." As he spoke, he caressed her red lips with a slight smile in his eyes. "Many people saw you coming today." Her eyes widened. "Yi Mulin, you're so bad. You tricked me. I didn't seduce you to bite me." He smiled and rolled the documents into a cylinder. "Play by yourself. I'm going to the meeting." She was anxious. She grabbed his arm and stammered, "Hey, you're going to the meeting like this?" He raised his eyebrows slightly. "What else?" She reached out and pulled his collar up a little. "At least block it a little." His gaze was unfathomable and there was a smile on his lips. "You can be shy too?" She stared at him with watery eyes. He smiled and entered the restroom. He tidied himself up in front of the mirror and turned his head. "Is this okay?" Bai Xueli nodded. He lowered his body slightly. She played dumb. "What are you doing?" "I'm going to the meeting soon." Bai Xueli, hurry up. In the end, she went over and kissed him. She murmured, "Yi Mulin, I'll wait for you here." A trace of warmth flashed through his eyes, but it seemed to be even hotter. However, he didn't do anything. He only reached out to pinch her face and left. After he left, Bai Shueli played games alone in his office for about 2 to 3 hours. He didn't come back for lunch. Instead, Secretary Li came back with a special lunchbox for her. Bai Shueli sat there. "Where is he?" Secretary Li held back his laughter. "Which him?" "Yi Mulin," Bai Shueli complained as she ate. "Secretary Li, you've been with him for too long. You've been corrupted." Secretary Li sighed and sat down to eat with her. Then she said, "I'm going to a meeting in a while. The bureau chief is very busy and hasn't eaten yet. Those who are in the meeting with me are being fucked. If I don't accompany you, I'll be in trouble too." There was a hint of worry in Bai Shueli's eyes. Is he fierce? There are so many official duties, and the subordinates are always messing around. The chief is always angry. It's not easy to work under him, but there is a future. Secretary Li smiled. He treats you differently. If you see him scolding his female subordinates, you will definitely be scared to tears. He scolded his female subordinates? Bai Shueli bit her lips. I thought his temper had changed a long time ago. Secretary Li could be considered an old employee of Yi Mulin's. He smiled. What changed? What the fuck did he change? He's still as heartless as ever. It's just because he likes you that he tolerates and loves you. Other people don't have such a good life. Secretary Li came over and whispered, "In this building, there are many women who throw themselves at the bureau chief. There are 4 or 5 of them openly. But they are all quite embarrassing. The whole building knows that the bureau chief doesn't like them." End of this chapter. Chapter 37-23. The Gift of Love Translator. Henyi Translations Editor. Henyi Translations, you're not transferring them away? Bai Shueli frowned. Secretary Li sighed softly. How can it be so easy? They're all relatives of the emperor, and they're closely related to each other. It's not good to offend them for such a thing. So, the bureau chief decided to treat them badly and have strict work requirements. But even so, there are still a few women who want to be promoted. They're trying their best to get ahead. Bai Shueli thought about it and felt that it was dangerous for her man to work here. But she couldn't say anything and could only eat quietly. After a while, she said, "He doesn't eat lunch?" Sigh, that's how the bureau chief got his stomach disease. Secretary Li brought up the past again. All right, Shueli, you have to remember what I said just now. Men have to be fed at home. He won't go out and cause trouble. Secretary Li winked and said, "You know what I mean." Bai Shueli looked down. "I don't know. I only care about whether he eats or not." Then she put down her chopsticks. "Can't he spare time for lunch? Even 10 minutes would be good. That's how it is when he's busy. Sometimes he has meetings from morning to night." Secretary Li exaggerated. "Why don't you go and ask the bureau chief to eat?" "It's not good for me to go." Bai Shueli buried her face and looked at Secretary Li. "Are you trying to frame me?" Secretary Li swore. "I definitely didn't mean that. I'm also worried about the bureau chief. But he won't listen to me." "Shueli, he will listen to you if you persuade him." Bai Shueli's expression was a little worried. Secretary Li added, "Think about it. The bureau chief's health is your sexual happiness." You're talking nonsense again." Bai Shueli bit her lip. "Then I'll go and ask him. I can't do anything if he doesn't listen." Secretary Li looked at her and laughed. "Shueli, why are you so arrogant?" She stared at Secretary Li. "This isn't my home. What can I do?" "There are so many people here," Secretary Li blinked. "The bureau chief won't be angry with you." She brought Bai Shueli to the door of the conference room, and Secretary Li opened the door a little. Oh my, the bureau chief was scolding someone, and the person he was scolding happened to be the one who seduced Yi Mulin in the past. Yi Mulin didn't give him any face and scolded him until he had no face left. At this moment, Secretary Li opened the door. Yi Mulin's voice still had some lingering anger. "What's the matter?" Secretary Li smiled. "Sir, Shirley is looking for you." Yi Mulin's expression changed in an instant. His voice became much gentler, and he had no intention of avoiding the topic. "Where is she?" Secretary Li pushed Bai Shueli out. The door opened, and Bai Shueli looked at the people in the conference room. There were dozens of them, and some of them looked like they wanted to eat her alive. Humph, she wasn't afraid. Who was she afraid of? When Yi Mulin returned home, he would have to be subservient to her. Why would she care about these women? So she coughed lightly. I can't eat alone. You have to accompany me. Then he added, it's not working hours right now. In the huge conference room, there was only silence. Everyone was looking at Bai Shueli. Based on the bureau chief's temper, he would definitely blow her up. That was because Bureau Chief Yi liked people who couldn't distinguish between work and work. Wasn't it the same for favored women? Unexpectedly, Yi Mulin stared at Bai Shueli and closed the document. Meeting adjourned. We'll continue at 2 in the afternoon. Chapter 3724. After Yi Mulin finished speaking, the meeting room was silent. No one dared to believe that the workaholic General Yi would say such words. In the past, when General Yi was angry, he wouldn't even be able to drink water, much less eat. But now, General Yi had changed, hadn't he? Under those gazes, Yi Mulin got up and walked to the door. He gently knocked the document in his hand on Bai Shueli's head. Bai Shueli looked up at him and he smiled. Didn't you say that you won't be able to eat if I don't accompany you? Aren't you going to leave? She replied with an "oh," and followed behind him obediently. After feeling a few unfriendly gazes, she hugged his arm and declared her sovereignty. Yi Mulin let her hug him, and then he reached out and hugged her in his arms. Fuck, what a great doting this is. Was General Yi going to give up his country for his beauty? If this matter was exposed, it would become a stain on his reputation and he didn't know what would happen in the future. But Yi Mulin didn't care at all. He hugged his wife and went to eat. In the office, he was still looking at the document, his brows furrowed. Bai Shueli scooped a spoonful of rice. Eat. He looked up and frowned. Just let me eat this. Who asked you to be so disobedient? She plucked the document from his hand. Eating is eating, these things can't be finished. Yi Mulin put down the document and said, if they all let me be less worried, I wouldn't need to take up the meal time. Then you should punish them. Hit your dick, hit it hard. She was trying to make him happy, so she said that. Yi Mulin looked at her and chuckled. Like hitting you? How can that be the same? She was anxious, her face a little red. He laughed. Yes, there's a difference. I can't strip them of their clothes and beat their butts, don't you think so? She glared at him angrily. Yi Mulin smiled and reached out to rub her little head. Alright, eat well. Take a break at noon before the meeting. She replied with an, and hugged him. After a while, he looked at her. Let's eat. How am I going to eat if you're so clingy? I just want to hug. She pursed her lips. I don't like the way those women look at you. He was angry and amused at the same time. He reached out and patted her. You're thinking too much. Bai Shueli bit her lips, reached out to hug him, and accompanied him to eat. She was also very clingy. After a while, he asked calmly, how did Secretary Li lure you over? Only then did she realize that she had been tricked by Secretary Li. Then she said angrily, she said a woman seduced you. So you fell for it? As he ate, he glanced at her. Bai Shueli, you're really something. Next time you go out, don't tell others that you're my wife. If you don't want to say it, then don't say it. Do you think you're old? Then she stuck out her tongue. All right, Yi Mulin, you have to eat properly. Your body is my happiness. He was pleased by her. Other people might not like her idiotic look, but he liked it very much. Actually, he knew that she could be independent a long time ago. The reason why she was like this was because she knew what he liked. She just wanted to make him happy. Yi Mulin suddenly reached out and patted her little head. Shueli, have I ever said that I love you? But I feel that you love my body more. She complained to him. His gaze was clear as he chuckled. You're right, actually. Chapter 3725. It took a while for Bai Shueli to come back to her senses and stare at him. Yi Mulin chuckled and pinched her face. Silly egg. I'm not a silly egg. She snorted, but she still reached out and hugged his arm, leaning against him. Silly egg was silly egg. Yi Mulin smiled. At this moment, Bai Shueli probably thought that he was the one who gave her happiness, but that wasn't the case. It was she who gave him happiness. In the past, in Yi Mulin's life, it was fine as long as he had a career. His wife and children were secondary and dispensable. However, when he confirmed that Bai Shueli was the other half of his life, she became more important than anything else. He could even give up his career as a lawyer. Silly egg definitely didn't know how much energy she had. This energy gave him a very happy feeling. He loved her very much, and he loved her more and more every day. However, he wouldn't say these words. A man's love was all done through acting. Yi Mulin smiled and patted his little wife's head. All right, rest for a while. There's a meeting in the afternoon. Then, he complained, there's really no end to it. This was a man's little trick. Only a sweet and naive girl like Bai Shueli would believe it. How scary was it? She had only been back for a short while, and the independent image of a woman she had painstakingly built up was completely destroyed. In an instant, she had become his worm again, and she was even more obedient and well-behaved. However, he doted on her even more. His little complaint immediately made her nervous. She asked, "Are you very tired?" He grunted and went to the bed in the lounge to lie down and close his eyes. His little worm immediately lay in his arms, making it convenient for him to hug her. Seeing that he didn't hug her, she quickly knelt beside him and carefully massaged his forehead, as if she was serving a master. Yi Mulin found it funny, but he held it in. If he laughed, she probably wouldn't fall for his tricks again. It was clearly a prank, but her little hand was really comfortable, and he actually fell asleep just like that. When he woke up, it was already an hour later. He opened his eyes and saw his little worm still kneeling beside him, gently massaging his forehead. He was touched and a little distressed. He reached out and took her hand. His voice was gentle. "I was just joking with you. Why did you take it so seriously?" His voice was husky and sexy. "Oh," she replied, then snuggled into his embrace and whispered, "I just want you to feel better." He looked at her with a clear gaze. Then she realized that he had misunderstood. She blushed and hugged him. "Don't talk nonsense." Yi Mulin chuckled for a while and got up reluctantly. He pressed her down and said, "Take a nap. I'll wake you up after work." She felt sorry for him, but she also felt sorry for herself. She had been massaging him for so long that her hands were sore. Thus, he fell asleep peacefully and slept until 6 o'clock in the afternoon. And in these 4 hours, Nocturnal Chieftain made his subordinates miserable. They thought that Nocturnal Chieftain was like a spring breeze, but it wasn't. Without Bai Shueli, Nocturnal Chieftain was still that strict Black Lord Bao. When Yi Mulin returned to his office, the rice worm was still asleep. He stood by the bed and thought silently that she had probably forgotten that An was at his mother's place. She had been taking care of An for the past few years. He thought that she had grown up, but when she returned to his side, she was still a child. It was infuriating and funny at the same time. However, it was good for her to be by his side. End of chapter. Chapter 37-26. He stood by the bed, leaned over and blew into her ear. "Lazybones, get up." When she woke up, her eyes were misty. Hugging her pillow, she complained, "So tired." He bent down to look at her. There was still a faint blue hue under her eyes. She probably hadn't slept well for the past few days. Mr. Yi checks himself and feels that he has overused her recently, so he smiles and kisses her eyelids. "I'll let you go tonight." There was a hint of fear in Bai Shueli's eyes. "What else did you want? What do you think?" He smiled and pulled her up, fixing her clothes and hair. "Go somewhere with me." She looked at him blankly. Yi Mulin only smiled faintly. "You'll like it." "Oh," she said as he brought her to the car. As she fastened her seatbelt, she said worriedly, "Do you think people will think that I'm your mistress?" He glanced at her and deliberately said slowly, "I think so." Bai Shueli glanced at him. "You're a bad person." He chuckled delightedly. "Then you're a bad woman." His eyes were filled with satisfaction because bullying her was his greatest pleasure. Bai Shueli didn't say anything to him. She couldn't beat him in an argument anyway. He was driving, so she didn't disturb him. She played by herself. The quiet space was filled with a sweet scent. She didn't speak until he drove the car into the parking lot of a building. Surprised, she asked, "This isn't a place to eat." Yi Mulin unfastened his seat belt, looked at her, and smiled gently. "This is where you eat." "Ugh." She stared at him and made a gesture of chewing something. "I'm chewing cement?" "Little idiot." He looked at her and smiled. Then he opened the car door. President. President Bai? Bai Shueli looked at him suspiciously and got out of the car as well. He extended his hand towards her. When she placed it in his palm, he reached out and held it. He brought her to the elevator and said, "This building is the headquarters of Jiahe Publishing. I'm buying it. It's for you." "Send me off?" Bai Shueli realized something and stopped in her tracks. She glared at him. "Jia? The publishing house I work for? You don't even know where you eat." He put on the attitude of a superior, but his eyes looked more like he was looking at a little idiot. Bai Shueli looked at him blankly. After a long time, she slowly said, "But buying Jiahe costs a lot of money, right?" Yi Mulin's eyes were somewhat clear. "A few billion. It's not a lot." She stammered, "But why did you buy it?" "What do you think?" He wasn't in a hurry to go up. Instead, he held her waist with one hand and smiled slightly. Bai Shueli bit her lips. "How would I know?" He leaned forward, lowered his head, and bit her lips. His voice was a little low. "Bai Shueli, if you continue to play dumb, believe it or not, I'll talk. She shrieked at once, afraid he would do something rash. He waited with a proud expression. Bai Shueli's little face was red. After a long time, she said softly, "It's because I'm happy." He reached out his index finger to touch her lips and said suggestively, "It's for my own happiness." Chapter 37:27. She blushed and stammered, "Yi Mulin, you won't ask me to do anything just because of this small favor. You're not such a petty person, are you?" His voice was soft and slow. "Coincidentally, I think this favor is not small." She stared at him with watery eyes for a long time and then held his hand. "Oh." He turned to look at her as he walked. "So, you mean you agree?" Then she reached out and hugged his arm. She placed her face on his arm and said softly, "Yi Mulin, how did you think of buying this for me?" He replied, "Because I want to make you happy." "You're so nice." She rubbed her face against his arm. "Hubby is so nice. Wake up, we haven't registered our marriage yet." He smiled and pinched her face. "Miss Bai, are you proposing to me again?" She was furious again. "Yi Mulin, you're so bad. If I'm bad, then you won't want to marry me anymore? That's good too." He teased her. Bai Shueli hugged him and didn't let go. She acted coquettishly, which was very beautiful. This building was all owned by Jiahe Publishing. She followed him in and went straight to the first floor. The executives of the publishing company were all working on this floor, including the conference room. The elevator door opened. Yi Mulin's financial manager, Ben, was already waiting for them. He smiled when he saw them. "Mr. Yi, Mrs. Yi." To Ben, Yi Mulin was his biggest client, not the bureau chief. Yi Mulin nodded at him, but his expression was serious. "Is everyone in the conference room?" Bai Shueli saw his expression. It reminded her of when he was a lawyer back then. She missed it, so she couldn't help but look at him for a while. Yi Mulin turned around and saw her mesmerized expression. He adjusted his expression. "President Bai, you can look at him slowly when we get home. Don't drool at a man in front of your subordinates now, okay?" She blushed and glared at him. Yi Mulin smiled and walked into the conference room with Ben. Bai Shueli followed behind him, but he pressed her gently to Ben's side. Yi Mulin did not participate, he was more like a bystander. In the meeting room, everyone was a veteran of Jiahe. Of course, the awesome George was also sitting there, and his new favorite, Serena, was sitting beside him. When they saw Bai Shueli, George was shocked, and Serena couldn't sit still. She and Bai Shueli were the two most popular translators in Jiahe. She had always wanted to suppress Bai Shueli, so she and George had worked together, using George's hand to suppress Bai Shueli. But what was the situation now? George blurted out, "What's going on?" Ben stepped forward and took out a document with a smile. Mr. Li Jiahe of this publishing house has transferred 100% of Jiahe's shares to Mr. Yi, and Mr. Yi has given it to Miss Bai Shueli. In other words, Miss Bai is now the owner and operator of this publishing house. Bai Shueli tilted her head and looked at Yi Mulin. What if I don't know how to run the company and cause it to collapse? If you fall, go home and give birth. Yi Mulin chuckled. Bai Shueli clenched her fists. I won't collapse it. Oh, let's wait and see. He chuckled. Then she felt that he was a pervert. He spent billions just to see her collapse it. Chapter 37-28 Gift of Love 12. After Ben finished his announcement, George was the first to disagree. That's impossible. Mr. Li would never sell Jia. This document must be fake. Ben smiled. I didn't sell it before because I wasn't satisfied with the price and the temptation wasn't strong enough. This time Mr. Yi has increased the price by 30%. He has no reason not to sell it. 30%? George's eyes were bloodshot. But Ben shrugged his shoulders. Probably because he wants to make Miss Bai happy. He turned his head and looked at Bai Shueli. President Bai, say a few words. Bai Shueli expressed that she did not know how to be a president, but since she was asked to speak, she would speak the truth. She adjusted her emotions and coughed lightly. Everyone, you have to work hard. You have to put in more effort than before because I don't know how to run a business. If you don't want to lose your job, you have to work hard to keep the publishing house. Then she looked down. The people below were also at a loss. Was that it? Then they cursed in their hearts. Shouldn't the boss think of a solution? Why did he let them think of a solution? They wanted to cry. It was the first time they had such a capricious boss. Bai Shueli silently cheered them on in her heart. Just because I don't want to go home to give birth, you guys want to rush. However, as the saying goes, a newly appointed official makes a clean sweep. She still announced that George was fired. This decision was very satisfying. Serena looked at George before shifting her gaze to Yi Mulin. She didn't feel any sympathy for George as he was just making use of their relationship. She was more interested in the man beside Bai Shueli. He bought Jiahe with a large sum of money without batting an eyelid, just to make the woman smile. Unlike George, Serena didn't let her anger get to her head. At this moment, she realized that the man in front of her was very familiar. Then she recalled. God, it was Yi Mulin. That unreachable man had actually appeared here and spent a fortune for a woman. Therefore, when Yi Mulin was about to leave with Bai Shueli, Serena chased after them and apologized to Bai Shueli sincerely. Shueli, I really didn't know that George would be so despicable. I've drawn a clear line between us. Besides, if you want to, you can still translate that book. Bai Shueli was a little confused. You broke up? Didn't you say that you would never leave me? Serena's eyes flashed with impatience. This little idiot. She squeezed out a beautiful smile. I feel uneasy because of George. Why don't I treat you to dinner? From the beginning to the end, Yi Mulin remained indifferent and let Bai Shueli send people away. However, it was obvious that his family's rice worm was not on the same level as this Miss Serena. He suddenly realized that what he liked was actually her simplicity. Whether she liked or disliked him, she was very straightforward. She used the clumsiest method to chase after Mubai. She did not even try to hide her feelings for him and was even better at using others. She was who she was, his worm. Nocturnal Chieftain suddenly felt blissful again. He coughed lightly. I'm hungry. Bai Shueli was stunned. She looked at him and then at Serena. You mean, let's have dinner together? He looked at her with a smile. Bai Shueli snorted. But we're going to your mother's house for dinner. It's not convenient. Let's eat alone. He took her hand and walked toward the door. Chapter 37-29, Marriage Proposal 1. She froze for a moment. Not bringing Serena? What do you think? He smiled. Bai Shueli hugged his arm. I don't like it when you look at beautiful women. Beautiful? Yi Mulin recalled the face that had undergone plastic surgery and frowned. Far worse than you. That shallow little worm couldn't help but be delighted. Really? At this moment, they had already reached the elevator. He turned his body and looked at her. Her face was fair, and she still had big European eyes. Her nose and lips were beautiful. Moreover, she really didn't mature as she grew older. She was still the same. Time seemed to have given her special treatment. Perhaps it was because she was pure. Yi Mulin stretched out his hand and caressed her face gently. Bai Shueli always felt that he was going to say something touching, but Yi Mulin always exceeded her imagination. His voice was hoarse. Why is there only one person? She's dumber than a pig and I still like her. After saying that, he let go of her face and stood there as if he was angry at himself. Because he liked a girl with the intelligence of a pig. Bai Shueli was hopping mad. He despised her again. And he even called her a pig. He was the real pig. He was as lustful as a breeding pig. When they got into the car, he came back to his senses. His little pig was still angry, and her mouth was very high. President Bai, are you angry? He buckled his seatbelt and tapped his fingers on the steering wheel happily. A man nourished by love. Bai Shueli turned her body and didn't look at him. He was too hateful. Yi Mulin looked at her angry face and smiled. He reached out and pinched her face. Let's go home. I'll cook for you, Ichim. She finally turned her head. Are there any additional conditions? Yi Mulin started the car and looked relaxed. There's one thing. You have to accompany me at night. As he said that, he reached out and held her hand with a hint of secrecy. Bai Shueli was stunned for a moment and then bit her lips. She knew that there was no lunch for an idiot in this world. No, it was a free dinner. Angry, and still angry, he finally spoke his mind. Yi Mulin, you're a pig. However, he was not angry. I'm a breeding pig, but you still like me to death. Otherwise, why would you be so angry when Serena invited me to dinner just now? Treat us to dinner, she emphasized. He chuckled. Are you sure she wants to invite you? Bai Shueli didn't say anything. After a while, she whispered, Yi Mulin, can you stop bullying me like this? He was surprised, but then he smiled. I'll try my best. But surely this is fun. As he said that, he reached out and pinched her little face. Little silly, stupid pig worm. She howled, took his hand off, and held it in her arms. He didn't say anything and just hugged her. Actually, to her, those Jiahe things were not important. Seeing George's ashen face, she was not too happy either. To her, being with him every day was a very happy thing. She couldn't help but rub her face on his arm and act coquettishly. Yi Mulin, have I ever said that I love you very much? He said seriously, it seems to be the first time. She wrinkled her little nose. Really? Yes, so don't you owe me a lot? Yi Mulin reached out and touched her little head. Bai Shueli thought about it and felt that it was right. Yi Mulin smiled silently. How dare you say that you're not a pig? I'll update again tonight. End of this chapter. Chapter 3730. Yi Mulin took her home. Halfway through the car, she was a little uneasy again. She looked at him eagerly. Mulin, shall we take Anan home? She had not been with Anan for 2 days, and she somewhat missed Anan. As she asked, she looked at Yi Mulin intently, looking at him longingly. Yi Mulin tilted his head and glanced at her, then smiled lightly. My mother called today and said that Anan is doing well with her. She also wants Anan to stay for a while. Really? She looked at him doubtfully. Yi Mulin sighed softly. Shueli, when did you become so distrustful of me? Still staring at him, she said very slowly, since I found you very nice. He chuckled. Which man isn't a pervert? Tell me. Of course, she couldn't answer as she counted on her fingers. Yi Mulin reached out and held her hand. He couldn't bear to tease her anymore. When they returned home, there was a table full of dishes. They were still steaming hot, but there was no one at home. Bai Shueli looked at him and then at him. Then, she wrapped her arms around his neck. Didn't you say that you cooked? Cooked. He pinched her nose as if he was thinking. I told you that we have a Tian Luo girl at home, but you didn't believe me. She leaned on his shoulder and laughed. After a while, she looked at him eagerly. Yi Mulin, I can actually cook at home. He knew what she meant. She was willing to cook for him and take care of the children, just like any other woman. She wanted to be a good wife and a good mother, but he couldn't bear to do that. He reached out to hold her little hand and rubbed it a few times. His voice was gentle. We're together again. She let out an "oh" and was carried up by him. He carried her like a little doll and placed her on the dining chair. She was a little curious and a little uneasy. She felt that it was too much to be pampered at such an age. Besides, he was really very busy during the day. She never thought that Yi Mulin would pamper her like this. She bit her lower lip, looked up, and reached out to tug at him. Sit down and eat too. He smiled and sat down. She scooped some rice for him, and the two of them ate quietly. It was heartwarming. After dinner, he carried her to the bedroom. She didn't object, but her little hand grabbed the collar of his shirt, feeling a little nervous. Everything happened naturally. As he said, they were back together again, so nothing was too much for them to do. He wanted her, so she hugged him and cooperated. She was very obedient. Yi Mulin happily did it twice. Seeing that she was so tired but still accompanied him, he couldn't bear to see her accompany him, so he let her go. After everything was over, he carried her to wash up and put her under the warm blanket. Just at this moment, his phone rang. Yi Mulin was about to pick it up when Bai Shueli woke up in a daze. What's wrong? He kissed her face. I'll answer the phone. Be good and sleep first. She made an "oh" sound and said in a daze, then I'll go to sleep first. Come over early. He smiled and walked out quietly with his phone in hand. The call was from Secretary Li, and it was urgent. After he picked it up, Secretary Li said directly, Chief, Shueli and an An's identities have been exposed. I've checked, and it was exposed by a person named George. Right now, the mainstream media is still waiting for the chief's explanation. They don't dare to write anything, but there are a lot of rumors online. Yi Mulin said calmly, keep it under control. We'll talk about it tomorrow morning. Secretary Li wasn't sure, and his voice became even calmer. I'll have to discuss this with Wen Yuan. He was prepared, but he was afraid that Wen Yuan wasn't ready. Secretary Li hesitated, but in the end, she still agreed. Actually, she wanted to say that if this matter were to blow up, it would affect Yi Mulin's future. But after thinking about it, Yi Mulin probably didn't care about such a position. So, let it affect it. But they didn't expect that someone would stand up before him. It was none other than Wen Yuan. Chapter 37-31. Wen Yuan faced the tricky questions of the reporters alone. She said calmly under the spotlight, Mr. Yi Mulin and I divorced a few months ago, so the rumors on the internet about Mr. Ye's illicit relationship are not true. That's all I want to say. She wouldn't say too much because it would be used against her. She was about to leave under the protection of her bodyguards, but a reporter asked a sharp question, Ms. Wen, is your son Yi Mulin's child? This question was tantamount to suspecting their marriage. If Wen Yuan admitted that Xiangnan wasn't Yi Mulin's child, it would have a great impact on Xiangnan. She looked at the reporter and answered softly, Yi Xiangnan is of course the child of the Yi family. There is no doubt about it. This answer was very subtle. The child of the Yi family was not Yi Mulin's child. She didn't answer the question anymore and walked out directly. But she saw Yi Mubai at the door. She didn't know why he arrived earlier than Yi Mulin. There was anger on his face and he grabbed her hand. Wen Yuan, are you crazy? Did she know how big the impact was after she announced such a news? Would the Wen family let her go? Without Yi Mulin's protection, it would be difficult for her to move forward. Didn't she think about all these? Did she just come to help others? He used to think that she was cunning, but now he only thought that she was stupid. Did she think that she was powerful enough to handle it? He dragged her to another room, the door slammed shut, and he rudely pressed against the door. He stared at her face. What do you want Xiangnan to do in the future? Xiangnan isn't Mulan's child. Do you want me to keep that position and let his real daughter and wife be his mistress? Wen Yuan's voice was very soft. Yi Mubai, I can't do it and I'm not that selfish. Yi Mubai was shocked. After a while, he growled, the child isn't my brother's. Why did you marry him? Why did you let Xiangnan's surname be? To him, this was simply inconceivable. Wen Yuan's expression was fearless. She looked at Yi Mubai and smiled faintly. There was nothing between us. Why would I hesitate when this marriage should have ended? And I don't need to explain anything to you. After saying that, she wanted to leave, but her wrist was caught by him. Her back was pressed against the door again, and it hurt. He stared into her eyes and said very softly, there's nothing between you and him. Then why did you seduce me before? Without waiting for her reply, he continued, pretending to be intimate with me to arouse my interest, Wen Yuan. If this isn't seduction, then what is? She knew that she couldn't escape, so she leaned against the door and looked at him with a sneer. Yi Mubai, have you been seduced? He approached her, his thin lips touching the side of her face. His voice was very soft. I'm not interested in married women who have given birth to children. That's great. Let go of me, I want to leave. She said expressionlessly. Yi Mubai still held her hand, and his eyes narrowed coldly. Believe it or not, once you go out, there will be reporters everywhere. You can't go out at all. They will skin you alive. Wen Yuan sneered like him. Now, it's more like you who wants to skin me alive, Yi Mubai. She liked him and was crazy about him. But after waiting for him again and again, she decided to give up. She didn't want to wait for a man who never cared about her. She didn't want to please a man who would only give her a check and give her pills after having sex. He didn't love her. She knew it a long time ago. She had always been the one who took the initiative, and she had always been the one who threw herself at him. She was cheap, she was shameless, she was too optimistic. Everything was over. She wanted to leave B City with Xiangnan and start a new life. Yi Mulan had given her a lot. She could live a good life even if she left the one family. Perhaps she would find another man. Next time, she would find someone who liked her, who would treat her very well, who would coax her, and who would love Xiangnan. She wanted someone who wasn't fierce at all. Happy Christmas Eve, everyone. Update tomorrow. Please remember the original domain name of this book. Jiutian Shenhuang mobile version website. Chapter 37-32. He stared at her face and said very slowly, Is that so? Do you think that I would have lust for a child's mother? He let go of her. You think too highly of yourself. He then looked at her suspiciously. You can't seduce my brother, so you set your sights on me. Let me tell you, I don't need you to tell me. Wen Yuan closed her eyes. A tear was already at the corner of her eye, but she didn't let it fall. Yi Mubai, I won't like you and I won't seduce you. Is that okay? After she finished speaking, the tear in the corner of her eye still fell down disappointingly. Yi Mubai was stunned for a moment. Then, he looked at her tear and seemed to be possessed. After a long time, he said in a hoarse voice, Do you really love him? Wen Yuan looked up and looked at him with tears in her eyes. She didn't say anything, but he took it seriously. To Wen Yuan, let him misunderstand. That way, it wouldn't be too embarrassing. Yi Mubai said softly, I can still take care of you and Xiangnan when you go to America. He really liked Xiangnan and was willing to take care of them. After all, they wouldn't have anyone to rely on in the future. Wen Yuan didn't say that she wasn't going to New York because she didn't want to say it. He would know when he found out. When that time came, he wouldn't have to take care of her and he would be able to relax. No matter what, the man in front of her was the man she liked. There were tears in Wen Yuan's eyes. She just hummed and thanked him. She pushed him away gently and walked past him. When she left, her hair brushed against his chest. Yi Mubai looked at her side profile and felt the last bit of warmth she left. He had an urge to hug her. It was an urge that belonged to a man towards a woman. However, he restrained himself. He watched her go, watched her open the door, and suddenly caught her wrist from behind. Wen Yuan turned her head and looked at him. His voice was deep. I'll send you back. Wen Yuan lowered his eyes and paused for a moment. When he thought of the reporters at the entrance, he nodded. She thought that she could really let it go. If she didn't, she would be embarrassed. She heard that Yi Mubai went to his girlfriend's house to meet his parents. He might get married, and if she continued to pester him like this, what would happen? She felt a little disgusted with herself. She felt that her life had been influenced by an idol from her youth. He was no longer the person she liked when she was young. They even had a child, and that was enough. On the way back, Wen Yuan sat in the back seat of his car and looked out the window at the street. It was especially quiet in the car. She just sat quietly in the car and quietly got along with him. She thought, this is the last time. As Yi Mubai drove, he would occasionally notice her behind the car. He looked at Wen Yuan in the rearview mirror. To be honest, she was very good-looking. Her looks weren't particularly outstanding, but her eyebrows were very comfortable and pleasant to look at. Perhaps because she had been pampered since she was young, Wen Yuan looked gentle and not aggressive. She was very suitable to be a wife. Yi Mubai suddenly thought of the night he saw in the villa. Wen Yuan was wearing spaghetti-strap pajamas and sat on Yi Mulin's knees. Her long black hair was messy and fell on her shoulders. From behind, it was a visual impact and very sexy. He suddenly felt a little uncomfortable. He couldn't tell why they were acting like a fake couple. He thought about how she had indeed seduced him before, but now she had given up. Had she really given up? He couldn't help but think. It's late at night. Try to be earlier today. This book came from. Chapter 37-33. Yi Mubai wasn't paying attention as he drove. Later, when Yuan's phone rang. It was Yi Mulin. She picked it up. Her voice was a little nasal and she didn't speak much. She just hummed a few times before hanging up. Yi Mubai looked at the rearview mirror. He only glanced at her and saw that her nose was a little red, as if she had been crying. He paused and asked softly, "Did he scold you?" Wen Yuan looked out of the window and said softly, "I'm just a little sad." Then, she murmured as if she was talking to herself, "I've lived with him for a few years, and now I'm a little sad. You won't understand." To her, Yi Mulin was a warm existence. When she was most helpless, he gave her a place to shelter from the rain. Otherwise, she might have left B City with Xiangnan a few years ago. In her heart, Yi Mulin had long been a family member, so Wen Yuan could not be so selfish. She could not be like before, relying on her status as the eldest miss of the Wen family to chase after a man relentlessly. If this continued, even she would look down on herself. She said slowly. Yi Mubai clenched his fingers. "You care about him a lot?" Wen Yuan looked up in surprise and looked at the back of his head. After a while, she smiled faintly. "Yi Mubai, you're thinking too much." It wasn't what he thought. What did he think? Did he think that she had that kind of feelings for Yi Mulin? As soon as she said that, the car came to a screeching stop. She paused for a moment and then looked at him with a hint of helplessness in her eyes. "Wen Yuan, if you love him, you can get him back. If you don't love him, then give up now because he's going to get married." He gripped the steering wheel tightly. "If you don't want to be an outsider and don't want to embarrass yourself, then break it off completely." Wen Yuan listened to his words and felt like it was a lifetime ago. She had heard these words before. Before he lost his memory, he always warned her not to be delusional. Was he going to say these words to her now? However, what he said, it made sense. She didn't defend herself and just said softly, "Xiangnan and I will leave. What you're worried about won't happen." It was true that she wanted to leave, but it wasn't New York. At this moment, she suddenly wanted to seduce him. For the last time, she had seduced Yi Mubai, who had lost his memory. She had made him always remember and hate her in his heart. This could be considered her revenge against him. Half an hour later, Yi Mubai's car stopped in the villa. Wen Yuan placed his hand on the car door as if he was about to get out, but she stopped herself and turned to look at him. "Do you want to see Miss Nan?" Yi Mubai placed his fingers on the steering wheel. In fact, he didn't have this plan at first. He was going to watch a musical with Lin Shui. If nothing unexpected happened, he would probably get engaged to her. Yi Mubai was going to Yi Mubai. Wen Yuan saw the hesitation in his eyes and forced a smile. If you have something to do, then forget it. Yi Mu-bai wanted to forget about it, but when she got out of the car and he was about to start the car, Xiangnan ran out of the villa and called out to him. Teeth up. Yi. Yi. Yi up. Just like when Yuan had said, although he wasn't Yi Mulin's child, he felt that he was the Yi family's child. He immediately gave up and turned off the car. He opened the car door and got out. He picked up the little thing and held it high. Xiangnan, do you miss Uncle? Xiangnan's answer was to kiss him hard on the cheek. Chapter 37-34. Yi Mu-bai's heart was very soft, and he kissed Xiangnan. Perhaps it was the nature of a father and son, he liked Xiangnan very much, but at this time, Yi Mu-bai would never have thought that Xiangnan was his child. He forgot everything and he easily accepted his family. He was not obsessed with remembering, but his forgetfulness made him forget the most important thing. He and Wen Yuan had a relationship. He held Xiangnan and played with Xiangnan. Xiangnan was very young. He secretly looked at his mother, and only when he found that his mother was not angry, he was relieved. At this time, it was almost noon. Yi Mu-bai had an appointment with Lin Shui, or it should be said that Lin Shui asked him out. Before he went over, Lin Shui called him, but the phone was in the car, so Yi Mu-bai did not hear it. And when Yuan quietly watched him play with Xiangnan, she looked very happy to see Xiangnan. Xiangnan had not been so happy for a long time. When Yuan's eyes were a little hot. She did not know if she did something wrong, and if she should not give up so easily, but she did not have the courage to try again. It was almost noon, and she went to the kitchen to ask the servants to prepare lunch. There was Xiangnan's favorite food and also Yi Mu-bai's favorite food if his taste hadn't changed. After she quietly ordered, she went upstairs to the living room alone and sat for a while. In fact, her luggage was already packed, and she was waiting to leave. Not to New York, but to H-City. A music academy in H-City had accepted her, and she also bought a good apartment in H-City. She was very grateful to Yi Mulin for this. He let her live respectfully after leaving the one family, and she also knew that half of it was for Yi Mu-bai. No matter what, she was going to leave this place, and she was a little reluctant. When Yuan's fingers fell in front of a piano. Many nights, when she thought of Yi Mu-bai, she would play this piano. At that time, Xiangnan would listen quietly by the side, as if he could understand. Wen Yuan smiled faintly, but it was a bitter smile. At lunchtime, both Xiangnan and Yi Mu-bai were sweating. After lunch, he took the little fellow to the guest room upstairs to take a shower. Probably because he was too tired, Xiangnan fell asleep after a while. Yi Mu-bai accompanied him for a while, then walked out with only a towel wrapped around his waist. He suddenly thought of Lin Shui's date. Actually, he didn't really like her, he just didn't hate her. He went downstairs to his car and took out his phone. He frowned when he saw the 5 missed calls and a few WeChat messages. He had forgotten everything. It was already 2 in the afternoon. He called her. Lin Shui was angry, but she did not dare to lose her temper at him. Instead, she acted like a spoiled child for a while, asking him to compensate her. Yi Mu-bai looked at himself and said in a low voice, "There's still time for the concert. Wait for me there. I'll be there on time." Lin Shui actually wanted to ask where he was, but she swallowed the words when they were on the tip of her tongue. Yi Mu-bai hung up the phone and went to the second floor. He wanted to ask Wen Yuan for a set of Yi Mulin's clothes. Their figures were similar, but when he knocked on the door, Wen Yuan was only wearing a bathrobe. It was obvious that he had just taken a shower. She looked at him and was stunned for a moment. "I thought it was Xiangnan." After saying that, she subconsciously wanted to close the door. An arm blocked the door. Yi Mu-bai pushed the door open and said calmly, "No need, I want to borrow a set of my brother's clothes. I'm going out later." Book from Chapter 37-35. When Yuan looked at him and nodded. "His clothes are in his room. I'll take you there." Yi Mu-bai's eyebrows twitched. Only then did he realize that the divorced couple had been sleeping in separate rooms. When Yuan adjusted his bathrobe and walked toward the opposite room, Yi Mu-bai followed and closed the door behind him. It was obvious that Yi Mulin had stayed here before. Everything was the same as before, but some of his clothes might have been taken away, so the changing room was a little empty. Wen Yuan opened a few cabinets, but she couldn't find anything that suited him. It wasn't until the last cabinet that she found a suit that also suited Yi Mubai. She gave it to him, then bent down to look for a matching tie and shoes. Her bathrobe was short, and when she bent down, Yi Mubai saw something he shouldn't have seen. It was very tempting. His Adam's apple couldn't help but move. It was hard to imagine that Wen Yuan would have such a devilish figure under such a calm face. To be honest, he was a man. If he said that he didn't have any thoughts, he wouldn't be a man. Wen Yuan seemed to have finally found his tie and got up to give it to him. Yi Mubai reached out and took it, thanking him. She wanted to walk out, but he reached out and pulled her back. In the next second, she was pressed against the closet. However, his actions were not too rough. At this moment, Yi Mubai had no intention of doing anything to her. He just stared into her eyes and accused, "You seduced me again." Wen Yuan bit her lips and turned her face to the side. Her heart was pounding. "I don't know what you mean." He stared at her, his eyes on fire. Yi Mubai had always been hesitant. Sometimes he suspected that she was seducing him, sometimes he felt that she was not. At this moment he really wanted to know whether she was seducing him or not. So he moved his body forward to trap her. Lowering his head, he kissed the corner of her lips and murmured, "If you're not seducing me, reject me now." Her eyes were misty, and her chest was heaving even more violently, almost touching him. His young body was ignited with a single spark. Yi Mubai gently bites her soft lips. "Refusing me proves that you didn't seduce me." Wen Yuan was trapped by him. It was very, very hot. She also felt like crying. In front of her was the man she had loved for so many years. When she was pregnant with his child, she thought he was dead. He came back, but he didn't recognize her. He hated her just like before. She told herself to be willful for the last time. She did not reject him. Instead, she wrapped her arms around his neck and kissed him with her eyes closed. Yi Mubai was stunned for a moment, then he felt something fall to the ground, and then he was controlled by Yu Wang. The adult man and woman embraced, kissed, and used all their imaginations to please each other's bodies. There was no love, but it was the most primitive desire between a man and a woman. Yi Mubai admitted that he was not a man who valued jade, but she seduced him again and again. Her figure was surprisingly good. Although she had given birth to a child, it was very suitable for a man to hug her. Yi Mubai went from being rough at the beginning to being engrossed in it. He didn't let go of her body the whole afternoon, hugging her again and again. His phone kept ringing but no one paid attention to it. On Yi Mulin's gray bedsheets, he passionately loved the woman who had just left his sister-in-law's identity. Perhaps there were some taboos about her identity, so it was especially different. In the end, he couldn't even remember how many times he had done it, but he felt very happy. That's the end of the update. Good night, dearest. I would like to chat with more like-minded people about new wife number 1, husband, addicted to pampering, winky face, winky face, winky face, winky face, talking about life, looking for a bosom friends. Chapter 37-36. When everything calmed down, it was already nightfall. Yi Mubai's cell phone had already run out of battery, and it lay on the side of his pillow in the dark and lonely light. His muscular body leaned on her and he lowered his head to kiss her lips. Wen Yuan closed her eyes and gasped for breath. After a while, she opened her eyes and stared at him. Her voice was soft. "Yi Mubai, is this considered as me seducing you?" His gaze was deep. Then he rolled to the side and said quietly, "I didn't take any precautions. Are you going to take your medicine or let nature take its course?" He was giving her a choice. If she took the pill, everything that had happened between them today would be over. But if she didn't take the pill, she might get pregnant and the child could not be aborted. He would choose to marry her. Wen Yuan stared at the ceiling. After a long time, she tilted her head and asked him, "Yi Mubai, do you like me at all?" He clenched his fists and answered honestly, "I have a desire for you." After he said that, her eyes were a little warm and sad. Even though some things were about to break out of the cocoon, she still held them back. She sat up and said softly, "I'll take the medicine." Yi Mubai was annoyed. He sat up, leaned against the headboard, and lit the cigarette. "You can also choose not to take the medicine." "Do you love me?" Wen Yuan's eyes were filled with tears. She bit her lips and looked at Yi Mubai. "Tell me you love me." At this moment, she felt like she was in a nightmare. It was as if she had returned to the time when she begged him for his love. She looked at him as if it were years ago, but Yi Mubai looked at her as a woman who had just gone to bed. Although he liked this woman very much, it was just an accident after all. However, he was the mastermind behind this accident, and he knew it very well. At this moment, she asked him if he loved her. He could make it up to her, but he couldn't say that he loved her against his heart. His voice was slightly hoarse. "If you want compensation," as soon as he finished speaking, she reacted fiercely. "Yi Mubai, I'm not for sale." Yi Mubai frowned. "That's not what I meant." Wen Yuan tugged at his hair and looked up. "You should leave. The clothes are over there. I'll take my medicine. I won't bring you any trouble, and I won't tell Miss Lin about this either." Yi Mubai's frown deepened. "I'll ask you one last time. What I want is someone who loves me." She finally burst into tears and hugged herself like a homeless stray animal. "But you're not." Yi Mubai's voice was slightly cold. "Is love that important?" Wen Yuan raised his eyes and looked at him for a long time before he murmured, "Yi Mubai, it's not that you haven't liked someone before. You just don't remember. Do you still remember Lin Cece?" Yi Mubai's expression was somewhat unsightly. Lin Cece. It was a name that made his heart ache. The person you like is going to remarry her ex-husband. You should have heard of Gu Zhe, the CEO of Hengtong Group. After losing her, he chased after her for many years. Wen Yuan smiled. "Yi Mubai, I don't want you to think that you don't know how to love someone for the rest of your life. In fact, you have loved someone, but the person you love is not me or Lin Shui." She raised her head and let her tears fall. Everything was over. She gave up. When she looked at him again, his expression was very unsightly. After a moment, Yi Mubai began to put on his clothes. He jumped out of bed and was about to leave, but he turned back. He said to her beside the bed, "I'll ask my assistant to send the check." Chapter 37-37. Wen Yuan's tears didn't stop. She half knelt on the bed, wrapped in bedsheets. She smiled through her tears. "I'll buy the medicine myself. I don't need the check. Don't worry, I won't have another child with a man who doesn't love me." She seemed to be saying to herself, "Never again." Yi Mubai stared into her eyes, then pinched her chin and bent down. "Is there anything else you haven't told me?" Her chin was a little sore. She looked up. "Nothing." Yi Mubai let go of her and walked out quickly. His steps were hurried, but Wen Yuan knew that he definitely wasn't going to find Lin Shui. He was going to find his past. Wen Yuan just sat there, smiling softly. Yi Mubai went downstairs, got into the car, and held the steering wheel. When he picked up his phone to make a call, he realized that it was out of battery, so he charged it. After a while, he called King. His tone was indifferent. "I want to check my past." King was very straightforward. 1 million. I'll send it to your phone in 10 minutes. Yi Mubai's voice was cold. "I don't want the official news on the internet. I want privacy, something that no one else knows except for me." King laughed. "Look at the information, give me a price. But it'll be a little late, it'll take a day or two." Yi Mubai hung up. He sat in the car for a long time. Then, he got out again, lit a cigarette in the dark, and looked upstairs. He looked at that room. The lights were on, but it was frighteningly quiet. Was she still crying? He was a little annoyed. Why did she have to ask for love from him? Why did she ask for something that she shouldn't ask for? Actually, he felt that Wen Yuan wasn't determined to have him. She was even doing it with him with the mentality of a one-night stand. When he wanted her, she was very cooperative and enjoyed it. He was a man. Although he hadn't had a woman in a long time, he could feel that she hadn't had a man in a long time. At that moment, he thought, who was the last man she had been with? Was she also like this? When that man wanted her, she couldn't wait to hug that man? Yi Mubai's expression became very ugly. He threw away the cigarette butt, stepped on it, reached out to open the car door, and drove away without hesitation. He was even a little annoyed. He was the one who had taken advantage of the situation. For some reason, he drove to a building that looked a little old. He was able to get here by instinct. Perhaps he used to drive here often. Yi Mubai sat in the car and didn't go anywhere. He just quietly smoked. Two people came down from the staircase. One of them was a very beautiful girl who looked familiar. Yi Mubai's heart even moved slightly because of her appearance. Behind him was a man he knew, Gu Zhe. Gu Zhe was carrying a suitcase in his hand, and he easily placed it in the trunk of a car. Then, he grabbed the arm of the girl in front of him, pressed her against the back of the car, and kissed her for a while. Finally, they drove away. Coincidentally, he had seen the entire process. This was the Lin Cece that Wen Yuan had mentioned. A girl who was going to marry someone else before he could remember. Even if he couldn't remember, his heart would still hurt. Yi Mubai's fingers gently stroked the steering wheel, and he suddenly felt a little hatred for Wen Yuan. Why did she tell him? This was almost revenge. Making someone feel pain was the best revenge. End of this chapter. Chapter 37-38. Yi Mubai's car was parked outside the apartment for the entire night. Later, Lin Shui called. He just gave a few perfunctory replies and hung up. On the other end, Lin Shui wanted to explode, but she didn't dare to. She didn't even dare to call him again. Yi Mubai leaned against the back of the chair and smoked. He was thinking a lot. His past with Lin Cece, and the entanglement with Wen Yuan in the afternoon. At dawn, he drove back to the hotel. After he took a shower, he received news from King. It was much faster than he had expected. Yi Mubai dried his hair as he received the news. It was some photos of him and Lin Cece, probably taken by the paparazzi. There were even photos of them kissing. He looked at himself quietly, looking at the way he looked at Lin Cece. He was sure that he had liked her. Otherwise, he wouldn't have looked at her like that. King made a call. Yi Mubai said quietly, "I'll transfer the money to you later." King stopped him and smiled. "These can be given away for free. There's also the highlight. Do you want it?" Yi Mubai narrowed his eyes. "What do you mean?" King smiled maliciously. "It's a very explosive photo. I think they probably spent money to keep it under wraps." Yi Mubai listened quietly, waiting for King to continue. King's voice suddenly became serious. "Mubai, the woman before you lost your memory wasn't Lin Cece. Even if there was a bit of romance between the two of you, it was stopped in time. The one who really maintained a long-term relationship with you, or rather, a physical relationship with you, was Wen Yuan, your ex-sister-in-law. I have a lot of photos that can prove that the two of you maintained a sexual relationship for at least a year." Yi Mubai's fingers tightened on his phone. There was no warmth in his voice. "Send me the photos." King sent them over immediately. One after another, it was very exciting. They were all photos of Yi Mubai and Wen Yuan. There were even short videos and videos of him doing all sorts of things to Wen Yuan in front of the camera. Each photo was more exciting than the one before. He watched in silence, his expression growing heavier and heavier. If he and Wen Yuan had maintained such a relationship, then whose child was Xiangnan? Yi Mubai put down his phone and dialed King's number. "I'll get my assistant to send you a check in a while. I'll make sure you'll be satisfied." King was not worried about this. The Yi brothers had always been generous. Yi Mubai hung up the phone, took off his bathrobe, put on his clothes, and jumped into the car, driving directly to Wen Yuan's villa. More than an hour later, the car stopped. He got off the car and walked straight to the hall. In the hall, there were two servants cleaning, and there were several cardboard boxes piled up. Yi Mubai raised his head and asked, "Where's Wen Yuan?" The servants in the family didn't know much, but everyone knew what happened yesterday afternoon. Second young master slept with Miss Wen. This relationship was messy enough. The servant shivered. Madam left with the young master early in the morning. Yi Mubai furrowed his brows. "Where did she go?" "I don't know. Madam didn't say. She only said to clean up the place and close the door. She might not come back for a few years," the servant said truthfully. Yi Mubai had a bad feeling. He narrowed his eyes and thought of Wen Yuan's pandering yesterday. Obviously, it meant for the last time. End of this chapter. Chapter 37-39. Yi Mubai immediately called King. Help me find out where Wen Yuan went. King shook his head and sighed. Mubai, are you sure you want to look for her? Are you going to marry her? Her son might be mine. Yi Mubai gritted his teeth. He wanted to strangle that woman to death. What was this? Sleeping with him before leaving so that he would never forget her? What kind of woman was she? She looked gentle and quiet, but in reality, the things she did were more shocking than the previous one. On the other side, King smiled. You can ask Chief Yi about this, because he was the one who suppressed those photos. For the sake of Wen Yuan's evil eye, he was willing to spend a fortune. He paused. After you get the answer, do you want to look for Wen Yuan? Yi Mubai held the phone so tightly that his fingers almost turned white. After a moment, he thanked him and put down the phone. He walked to the car and opened the door. The servants were worried and ran over to ask, Second young master, what happened? Yi Mubai's expression didn't look good. It's nothing. If Wen Yuan calls, don't tell him I came. Under the servant's surprised gaze, he started the car and left. It was Sunday. Yi Mulin was in the condominium. Yi Mubai drove the car over, went up to the top floor, and pressed the doorbell fiercely, causing a couple who were in the middle of doing it to lose interest. Especially when Yi Mulin opened the door with a black face, wearing only a bathrobe. It was Yi Mubai who opened the door. Yi Mulin frowned. What are you doing here so early in the morning? Yi Mubai took 2 steps inside and asked in a tense voice, Is Wen Yuan's child mine? Yi Mulin still frowned. Is she pregnant? Brother, you know what I'm asking. Don't play dumb with me, Yi Mubai asked seriously again. Is Yi Xiangnan my son? Yi Mulin stared at him. After a while, he slowly said, Looks like you know something. Yi Mulin took a cigarette from the vestibule, lit it, and said to Yi Mubai, Have a smoke and sit over there. I'll come out after I talk to Shirley. Yi Mubai was particularly annoyed. He took a pack of cigarettes and a lighter, walked over to the sofa, lit it, and looked at him. Hurry up. Yi Mulin smiled faintly, walked quickly into the bedroom, and closed the door. Bai Shueli sat up and asked, Why is little Bai here? Yi Mulin walked over and sat on the edge of the bed. His affair with Wen Yuan has been exposed. He gently ruffled her hair. I think they accidentally overslept again. Wen Yuan left, and now he's starting to suspect that Xiangnan is his son. I'll talk to him for a while. You can sleep for a while longer. He lowered his head and kissed her forehead. Good girl. She pulled his arm. Is it possible for them to be together? Yi Mulin shook his head. I don't know. The reason why he didn't tell Yi Mubai directly was that he didn't care about Wen Yuan a few years ago. He just maintained a physical relationship with him. He wasn't responsible for it, but he couldn't bear to not sleep with him. Not to mention now. There was no reason to use Xiangnan to do anything. It wouldn't be good for Xiangnan. Yi Mulin patted his little wife. Good girl, don't think too much. Bai Shueli nodded and lay down. After Yi Mulin left and closed the door, she secretly took out her phone and sent a WeChat message to Lin Sisi. Sisi, it's over. Little Bai found out that Xiangnan is his son, but Wen Yuan ran away. Chapter 37-40. On the other side, Lin Sisi replied to Bai Shueli with a surprised expression. She knew that Yi Mubai had forgotten everything, but she really didn't expect that Wen Yuan's son was Yi Mubai's. Many years ago, Yi Mubai had slept with Yi Mulin's fiancée. Just thinking about it was exciting enough. The 2 girls chatted for a long time under the quilt. Gu Zhe came out of the bathroom and saw Lin Sisi playing with her phone. Her pinky finger was missing. His heart ached for a moment, but he still smiled and went over. Who are you talking to? Lin Sisi put down her phone and looked at him. It's Shirley. Gu Zhe was only wearing a bathrobe. He leaned against the headboard and looked down at her. What did they say? Lin Sisi and Gu Zhe had reconciled. She was no longer as cold as before and was acting coquettishly. She looked at him and bit her lower lip. I said you can't be unhappy. Gu Zhe held her waist and smiled faintly. It depends on what you're talking about. Lin Cece leaned into the crook of his arm and looked up at him. Then she moved her little face closer to his, her fingers gently caressing his lips. It's about Mubai. Gu Zhe and Yi Mubai were rivals in love. Yi Mubai liked Lin Cece for a long time. At this moment, his little wife said that she was talking about Yi Mubai. President Gu snorted, picked up a cigarette, lit it, and took a puff. Tell me about it. Lin Cece leaned into his arms and took away his cigarette. You're not allowed to smoke. What if I get pregnant? She stroked her belly and looked at him. Gu Zhe, I really want a child. Gu Zhe smiled. You want children? You have to work hard. As he spoke, he was about to press her down again. Lin Cece hugged his neck and stopped him. Let's talk business. In fact, Gu Zhe was just pretending, and then he just smiled and let it go. Lin Cece hugged him and said softly, when Yuan's child is Yi Mubai's. Shirley told me just now. Now when Yuan seems to have left B City. Old Bai is going crazy. Gu Zhe snorted. Feeling sorry for her? I didn't. She hugged him and whispered, Gu Zhe, we're going to get married. Can you stop being jealous? He smiled faintly, hugged her, and kissed her again. His mood was complicated, but at the same time, it was soft. After so many years, she had turned back into the little fool she used to be. She was willing to let him love her again. While Gu Zhe and Lin Cece were in a good relationship, the Yi brothers were not as warm. Yi Mulin walked out, closed the door, and sat opposite Yi Mubai. Yi Mubai smoked fiercely and looked up. There was a hint of red in his eyes. Can you tell me now? Is Xiangnan my son? Yi Mulin also lit a cigarette. After taking a puff, he looked at Yi Mubai and smiled. If he is, what will you do? Yi Mubai stared at him. Yi Mulin sighed. When Yuan has liked you for many years. Mubai, I have something to tell you, because you are my brother. He said slowly, before you lost your memory, your relationship with Wen Yuan was just one of flesh and blood. You didn't promise her anything, and perhaps you didn't love her. But I think it's more or less the same. Wen Yuan probably left because he gave up. If that's the case, do you still want to get her back? Do you want to marry her or take back the custody of Xiangnan? Do you want to marry Lin Shui and let Xiangnan have a stepmother? Update tomorrow morning. Chapter 3741. Yi Mubai took a drag of his cigarette and looked up. I won't marry Lin Shui. Yi Mulin smiled faintly and then looked at Yi Mubai. Then are you going to marry Wen Yuan? How are you going to treat her after you marry her? Are you going to treat her with respect or be as cold as ice? Are you going to leave her in city be alone in New York or bring her to New York with you? He paused. Mubai, if Wen Yuan is another Lin Shui, forget it. Let her go and let yourself go. He got up and patted Yi Mubai's shoulder. I don't want to repeat what happened many years ago. Yi Mubai clenched his fingers. Tell me her address. Even if it's not for Wen Yuan, Xiangnan is my son. I can't not see him in this life, right? You have to find out yourself. Wen Yuan didn't tell me either. Yi Mulin shook his head. Mubai, calm down and think about what to do next. Calm down? Yi Mubai couldn't calm down. Wen Yuan's departure and yesterday afternoon's intimacy seemed to have thrown a huge bomb into his heart. He had never felt that there was a woman as despicable as her. She ran away after sleeping with him, and they even had a son. Yi Mubai narrowed his eyes and got up. Yi Mulin also got up, but as soon as he got up, Yi Mubai punched him. With a bang, Yi Mubai's body sank into the sofa again. He covered his nose and cursed. Bastard, I've helped you raise your son for so long. Yi Mubai glared at him and slammed the door. At this time, Bai Shueli also ran out. Seeing her husband's nose bleeding, she immediately covered it with a tissue. Bai, why are you like this? Yi Mulin looked at his wife's anxious look and squinted at her. Didn't you like him the most in the past? Now you know that men are violent. She said angrily, you can't even beat him. He was stunned and then smiled. When it came to her, she was always right. He did not care that his nose was bleeding. He reached out and hugged his little wife in his arms, wanting to continue being intimate. Bai Shueli naturally refused. She bit her lips and said, "You're bleeding." "It doesn't matter." Yi Mulin insisted on continuing. She pushed his shoulder and looked at him with a sad look. "No, I mean it's dirty." Yi Mulin was stunned for a moment. He used a tissue to wipe the blood from his nose bit by bit. Then he pounced on her like a tiger pouncing on a rabbit and pretended to bite her. "I will let you know what is dirty." Bai Shueli screamed in response. Her hands and feet were pressed down by him, and she struggled to crawl forward. She had always known what he liked. She climbed all the way to the master bedroom and was already teased by him. She gently drew on his chin with her little hand and bit her lip. "Are you really not going to ask about Mubai and Wen Yuan?" Yi Mulin's expression was somewhat complicated. After a long while, he spat out a few words. "It's not convenient." She laughed. "Yi Mulin, your period is here. What's inconvenient about it?" He lowered his head and bit her, not too hard, making her scream. His voice was heavy. "Let me check to see if it's inconvenient for you." As he said that, he forcefully wanted to check. Bai Shueli grabbed his hand and begged for mercy in a soft voice. No matter what she said, she couldn't stop him. "And you said that my period is here, huh?" He chuckled softly and nibbled on her little chin, enjoying her to his heart's content. Please remember the original domain name of this book. Jiutian Shenhuang Mobile Version Website. Chapter 3742. Yi Mubai went downstairs from the apartment. He sat in the car but didn't leave immediately. Instead, he smoked 2 cigarettes. Sitting in the car, he thought about a lot and straightened out everything from the time he saw Wen Yuan again. She was shocked when she saw him. Later, when he went to the villa, she deliberately seduced him. Did she plan to seduce him when he lost his memory and sleep with him as his sister-in-law? Why didn't she mention the past? Did she think that he would fall in love with her if he could start over again? Yi Mubai smoked and then smiled coldly. He started the car and asked his assistant to book the earliest flight to New York for him. 18 hours later, Yi Mubai was lying on a recliner in a hospital in central New York. He was undergoing hypnosis, trying to recover his past memories. In the darkness, he inserted Wen Yuan into his memory. In his deep sleep, the fragments of the past pieced together, and the scenes appeared in his mind one by one. Yi Mubai suddenly opened his eyes, his forehead and back covered in cold sweat. The doctor in front of him smiled. "Mr. Yi, it seems that you have recalled the past. The reason why you forgot before was because of the existence of resistance. Now that you understand, you remember." The existence of resistance? Was it Wen Yuan? Yi Mubai closed his eyes. When he opened them again, he had already made up his mind. He got up and put on his shoes. This time, his flight flew to H City. King had found Wen Yuan's whereabouts. Of course, it also cost Yi Mubai 20 million. King was simply the black market in the industry. When Yi Mubai appeared in front of Wen Yuan, it was almost 11 o'clock on Saturday night. He had booked a hotel, but he still went directly to her apartment. It was a nice apartment, more than 100 square meters. Her family background was good. Even if she divorced and moved out, Yi Mulin wouldn't treat her badly and she wouldn't feel wronged. Yi Mubai thought after seeing the furniture and decoration. Wen Yuan should be asleep. When he opened the door, he was wearing pajamas. He looked at him for a long time and then whispered, "Why are you here? Why else would you open the door dressed like this?" Yi Mubai squeezed in and stared at her with burning eyes. She was only wearing pajamas. Although it was pure cotton, it wasn't too thick. In Yi Mubai's eyes, it was the kind that attracted bees and butterflies. His gaze was unfriendly as he walked past her. Wen Yuan looked at him. After a long while, he finally pulled on his clothes and murmured, "What brings you here?" She remembered that they had made it clear that it was just an accident that day. She closed the door and turned her head to watch him walk to the sofa and sit down, so she also sat down. She lowered her voice to avoid waking up Xiang'an. "Yi Mubai, I've taken my medicine. Don't worry, I won't make trouble for you." He stared at her for a long time before saying softly, "Wen Yuan, I remember everything from the past. Her face was deathly pale. As for him, he looked at her face with admiration. Then he said even more slowly, Yi Xiangnan is my son, isn't he? Wen Yuan answered very quickly. She closed her eyes and bit her lips. He isn't. Xiangnan. This name says it all. Yi Mubai reached out and pulled her closer. She fell into his arms in her pajamas. He was in a hurry and had been rushing back and forth. He hadn't shaved and hadn't showered for 2 days, but he was full of masculinity. She fell into his arms, smelling his scent and his body that was as hard as iron. All of this made her panic and scared. End of chapter. Chapter 3743. Yi Mubai's eyes locked onto her, and his voice became softer. If you say no, we can do a DNA test. Wen Yuan felt weak all over. She looked at the man in front of her, closed her eyes and murmured, Yi Mubai, what do you want? Why don't you ask me what I want? He stroked her face gently with his fingers. Wen Yuan, actually, I want to ask you what you want. You've been trying so hard to get close to me. You gave birth to my child, but you didn't get anything. Don't you think it's a waste? As he spoke, his finger moved to her lips suggestively. It had been like this in the past. He liked her body, liked making love with her, and enjoyed it, but he had never been able to really like her. He had always loved Lin Cece, not Wen Yuan. If he liked her even a little bit, he wouldn't be willing to hurt her like this. Wen Yuan slowly opened her eyes and looked into his eyes. What do you want? Is it Xiangnan? Let's get married. Yi Mubai said quickly, but his tone was firm. Since we have a son, let's get married. I'll take you and Xiangnan to the United States. It's better for Xiangnan. He's in H City and it'll be just as good. Wen Yuan said quickly, and then she struggled away. She retreated a step away from him, but when he reached out, she was in his arms again. Yi Mubai frowned and stared at Wen Yuan. You want Xiangnan to be a single-parent child? I'll get married again. Wen Yuan looked down and said in a low voice, I won't be single forever, Yi Mubai. We've missed each other in our lives. Without Xiangnan, we're already 2 unrelated people. Really? He sneered and lifted her chin. Then why did you tempt me to sleep with you that day? Wen Yuan, don't say that you didn't mean it. You're a woman. Don't you know what it means to a man when you dress like that? His fingers gently pinched her chin. And we've slept together many times. I think you know what kind of style I like best, don't you? No. No. Wen Yuan desperately shook her head, but her face was in his hand and she couldn't break free. Tonight Yi Mubai was frightening. He stared into her eyes. Do you dare to say that you don't feel anything sitting on my lap? His large palm was holding her, separated only by a thin layer of fabric, which made her feel ashamed and resentful. She couldn't stand him treating her like that. She lay there and cried softly, Yi Mubai, let go of me, bastard. He withdrew his hand, still staring at her. You're the bastard if you're not satisfied, aren't you? In the past, you were so proactive and went to my place again and again. Didn't you want me to satisfy you? Didn't you just want to sleep with me? Why have you become so reserved after getting married once? He was very domineering. He directly put her down on the sofa and looked down at her eyes. Look at you. You're clearly the same as before. Stop talking. Wen Yuan bit her lips and turned her face to the side with a red nose. Yi Mubai, I'm not what you think I am. Let's end it. If you didn't want to sleep with me that day, I would really think that you've turned over a new leaf. But obviously you're not. Before you ran away, you even wanted to use me to satisfy you. He gently bit her lips. But you haven't had a man all these years. Is there no one who can satisfy you? Try to update 3 more chapters at night. I'm always sleepy. End of this chapter. Chapter 3744. Actually, he admitted that he was a little uncomfortable. This woman had given birth to his child, but she had been married to his brother for a few years, when Yuan couldn't take it anymore. Her eyes were watery. Yi Mubai, you bastard. I don't want you here. You don't want me? His eyes were cold. If you don't want me, you chased after me every day and climbed into my bed when I was drunk. Wen Yuan, have you forgotten that you used my big brother to get close to me? Have you forgotten how you used the identity of my sister-in-law to seduce me? His fingers treated her mercilessly, and his voice was hoarse. Look at yourself. Do you want to see what you look like now? You said you don't want me, but Wen Yuan, your body doesn't show that. She was treated so badly by him that she almost couldn't speak. Yimubai, let me go. I don't want to be like this. He treated her mercilessly, and there was no expression on his face. Suddenly he smiled. Wen Yuan, you've always been the one who won't let me go. She was stunned. He let go of her, sat on the other side, lit a cigarette and took a puff. Wen Yuan sat up awkwardly and pulled up her clothes. She wanted to escape, but he said slowly, if you dare to leave, I'll do it in front of Yi Xiangnan. You won't be able to escape for the rest of your life. Her face was deathly pale. Are you afraid? Yi Mubai held the cigarette and rubbed his forehead with his thumb. Wen Yuan, why didn't you think about this day when you seduced a man? You thought you could escape after sleeping with me, didn't you? She sat there in a daze and murmured, how did you know? He stared at her eyes and smiled. There were many wonderful scenes of us in the past that were captured by the paparazzi. My brother spent a lot of money to buy them. Wen Yuan didn't say anything else. She just sat there in a daze. Yi Mubai smoked. After a long time, he looked up at her. Go to New York with me. Xiangnan needs a normal family. Wen Yuan looked at him in a daze again. Do you want me to say that I love you? Yi Mubai frowned. Wen Yuan, don't be too greedy. Wen Yuan blinked gently. Is it greedy to ask your husband to love you? Her hands were placed on her lap, just like a primary school student. In fact, she was always at a loss in front of him, always in a weak position. She looked at the man in front of her absent-mindedly and smiled sadly. Yimubai, I give up. Really, you must not have heard when I started to chase after you. Since you acted in your first movie, I've watched every poster of you and every movie of yours many times. It's not an exaggeration to say that I'm a fanatic fan. As she said that, she paused and licked her lips. But at the same time, I'm the eldest daughter of the Wen family. I can't chase after you all day like those little fans. Our families are well matched, and I can't chase after you all day like Bai Shueli. My upbringing doesn't allow me to do that. I used to envy Bai Shueli, and I also thought that you would end up with her, but you didn't. You fell in love with Lin Cece just when I wanted to confess to you. Wen Yuan looked a bit dazed. At that time, I thought that we weren't young anymore, and you hadn't had a girlfriend. Maybe you would be willing to settle down, and I knew that I was very suitable to be a wife. I even thought that if you had something with other women after marriage, I would be able to tolerate it. But now I feel that that kind of feeling is the feeling of a fan towards an idol, not the feeling that a wife should have towards her husband. Yi Mubai, after all that I've been through, I finally said to myself that I don't want the passion that you've given me. I want to start my own life again, even if you threaten me with Xiangnan. He was still frowning. Wen Yuan, I won't have any messy women after marriage. He wasn't so bad that he wouldn't mess around after marriage. Wen Yuan raised his eyes and looked at him. Tell me that you love me. Even if it was a lie, she was willing to believe it. However, Yi Mubai didn't say it. He was unwilling and disdainful to lie to a woman. He really didn't fall in love with her. He had never tried to understand her. All his love had indeed fallen on the girl named Lin Cece. Even now, he still had feelings for her. And Lin Shui, whom he had chosen before, looked a bit like Lin Cece, but he didn't have feelings for her, nor did he have any feelings for her. Wen Yuan had a child, which also made him have feelings for her, so he didn't have to think about it. He was willing to marry Wen Yuan. However, other than this, there was nothing else. He was a practical man. He didn't know if he would love her in the future, but if they got married, he would use her body a lot. The few times that afternoon made him understand why they couldn't break up in the past, and why they would always roll into bed after breaking up. Their bodies were too compatible. She was the kind of lady who looked gentle on the surface, but when it came to bed, men couldn't control themselves. Wen Yuan had a seductive body. Even though he was very angry at her now, he still wanted her. Wen Yuan's body was seductive, but he still wanted her. Yimubai narrowed his eyes. Other than love, I can give you anything. But other than this, I don't want anything else. Wen Yuan said stubbornly. Yimubai stared at her. Wen Yuan, are you childish enough? Everything between us, including Xiangnan's birth, was initiated by you. Now you don't want to be responsible for his life, do you? Wen Yuan grabbed his hair. There's no problem with Xiangnan's personality. He's very smart. He won't ask me to accept a marriage that I don't want. You can rest assured. I can rest assured. He sneered. When I didn't know, I had a son. Wen Yuan, you're retreating in order to advance. What tricks do you want to play? She turned her face to the side in embarrassment and closed her eyes. I didn't. If you don't believe me, we can sign an agreement. I won't use Xiangnan to threaten you. You can marry Lin Shui. He stared at her. Wen Yuan, say it again. Chapter 37:45. After she finished speaking, he stared at her and asked her with a cold voice, I'll ask you again. Either you get married, or I'll take Yi Xiangnan away. He'll have a better future if he follows me. Wen Yuan's entire body was trembling. You can give him a future, but can you give him love? He looked into her eyes and suddenly realized a fact. Yi Mubai moved closer to her face and pressed his thin lips against hers. Wen Yuan, do you hate me? Her lips were tightly pursed, and she didn't make a sound. Yi Mubai narrowed his eyes. Because I don't love you, so you hate me? His fingers gently caressed her face. When we first started, I said that there was only sex and no love between us. It was impossible for us to get married. But Wen Yuan, tell me, how did we get a child? His hand gently touched her neck and slid down her veins, as if he could break her neck with a single force. Wen Yuan closed his eyes. This is the last time. You didn't use any protection. Why didn't you take the medicine? He stared at her with a burning gaze, not letting go of any of her expressions. Wen Yuan smiled miserably. Yi Mubai, if you don't want this child, you can leave now. I'll give up, okay? I won't pester you anymore, I won't seduce you anymore, and I won't appear in front of you anymore. She smiled and cried. Yi Mubai, really, you can pretend that it never happened. You can still go back to America and be your director. I won't look for you again. Even if I might marry Lin Shui? He looked into her eyes and said in a heavy tone, Wen Yuan, have you thought it through? Her face was covered in tears, but she still said, yes, I've thought it through. She wasn't a child anymore. Before she left, she had thought it through clearly. She wanted to start over. Xiangnan was also a very smart child. He would make her happy and they would all make her happy. In the past, without Yi Mubai, they were fine, and they would be fine in the future. Yi Mubai looked at her for a long time and suddenly smiled. Wen Yuan, if you think it through, don't change your mind. Don't show up in front of me one day and tell me that you're pregnant with my child again. Damn it, you better figure out whether you have my child in your stomach now. I've taken my medicine. Her voice was a little flustered. Her eyes were filled with tears and she felt a little humiliated. Perhaps, in Wen Yuan's life, she had always been happy. She was the eldest daughter of the Wen family, and later on, she married Yi Mulin. No one had ever looked down on her. She was honorable, but in front of Yi Mubai, she would always be a tiny fan. Wen Yuan was a mature woman, but in front of Yi Mubai, she was always like a young girl, full of emotions. Now, everything was over. She didn't want to be that young girl anymore, because she had Xiangnan. She couldn't let Xiangnan suffer for her own feelings. Yi Mubai didn't love her. She didn't want Xiangnan to see his parents not loving each other. This kind of family wasn't good for Xiangnan. When the child grew up, he would understand. Wen Yuan wholeheartedly wanted him to leave, wanted him to give up, and he didn't believe her. She closed her eyes. I have ordinary cold medicine and anti-inflammatory medicine here. If you're worried, she stood up and took out a box of medicine from the small drawer. She poured out 4 or 5 pills and stuffed them into her mouth. She picked up a glass of water and drank half of it before swallowing all the medicine. Yi Mubai's expression was ugly. End of this chapter. Chapter 3746. When Yuan's face was even worse than his, and it was also very pale. She said softly, "You can rest assured now. Even if I have a child, I can't give birth to it." After saying that, the cup between her fingers fell on the coffee table, and the water splashed everywhere. However, she seemed to be unaware of it. She just looked at him and smiled faintly. It was as if she was mocking him and also mocking herself. Yi Mubai just looked at her and kept looking at her. After a long time, he said, "It's good that you've thought it through." He stood up and said indifferently, "I will pay the child support fee, and I will also ask to visit him from time to time. He is my son, and there is no reason for you to monopolize him." Then he lowered his eyes. "I will ask the lawyer to come over tomorrow, if you haven't changed your mind." When Yuan looked down and didn't say anything, Yi Mubai stared at her for a long time. She thought he would leave, but he didn't. Instead, he took off his coat, threw it aside, and walked straight to the children's room. When Yuan came back to her senses and stopped him, her face was very ugly, and she bit her lip. "What do you want to do?" "I'll sleep with Xiangnan. Otherwise, do you think I should sleep with you, Miss Wen?" His voice was also very cold, and it was a little mocking. When Yuan bit her lower lip, "Can you sleep on the sofa, or I'll sleep on the sofa in the master bedroom? There are no extra rooms here." She knew that if he really fought with her, she had no chance of winning. After she said that, Yi Mubai frowned. Suddenly, he came over, grabbed her body, and walked to her bedroom. When Yuan was scared, he took her away, closed the door, raised his hand, and took off his shirt. He took her to the soft bed. It was a little comfortable, and her breath was everywhere. He fell on the bed with her. He didn't do anything, although he had the intention. But basically, Yi Mubai was also a man with principles. He just trapped her and said in a deep voice, "If you still think it's not good to get married after this night, I will ask the lawyer to come over tomorrow morning." He had been running back and forth for a few days, and he was also tired, so he decided to sleep after saying that. He didn't even take a shower. After when Yuan was held in his arms, her nose was filled with his breath. In fact, she knew what he meant in her heart. He was telling her that a marriage without love and only sex was not so unbearable. However, she couldn't get over herself. She didn't want to chase after a man who didn't love her. When Yuan closed her eyes, she wanted to ignore this feeling, but she couldn't. She didn't want to cry, but she did. The one who was hugging her was not just a man. He was not just Xiangnan's father. He was her entire youth. She closed her eyes, turned around, and hooked her arms around his neck. Yi Mubai closed his eyes, but the corners of his mouth were slightly raised. He put his hands around her waist and leaned forward to kiss her. When Yuan lowered her head and didn't let him kiss her, she just buried her face in his chest and quietly felt his warmth. Yi Mubai lowered his head and looked at her. He didn't force her. He was too tired and he fell asleep just like that. Or maybe he didn't love her. If he had coaxed her that night, if he had insisted on accompanying her, maybe they wouldn't have been separated like this. Maybe when Yuan wouldn't have given up. They had shared countless times and they had a child. But in such a quiet night, they were still like strangers. She didn't feel warmth in his arms. He kissed her just now because of Yuan. Updated tomorrow at noon. You're tuning in to the Dreamy Chapters YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.